There are moments in history when rivalry becomes more than a contest between powers. It becomes an atmosphere, a force, a tide that pulls entire generations into its current. The long struggle between Genoa and Venice was exactly that. It was not one war, but a chain of conflicts that stretched across 191 years. It was a contest that shaped the Mediterranean world and defined how Europe traded, how it sailed, how it governed itself, and how it imagined the sea. Understand this rivalry, we must picture two worlds that grew from the same waters, yet evolved into opposites. Venice rose from a shallow lagoon, built upon timber, salt, and the will of a community that refused to kneel before great empires. Genoa stood firm against the cliffs of the Ligurian coast. It was a city that clung to hard stone and used that same stubbornness to carve its place in the world. Both were maritime republics. Both were ruled by merchant elites who believed that the sea belonged to those who dared to master it. Both saw trade as power, and both knew that whoever commanded the routes of the Mediterranean would command the future. The Middle Ages were an age of commerce as much as an age of faith. Pilgrims moved toward the Holy Land. Merchants moved toward Constantinople, Alexandria, Tanna, and Tunis. Everywhere the great ships of Europe crossed the sea. They carried more than goods. They carried influence. They carried the ambitions of the cities that sent them. The Mediterranean became a living map of wealth, and every harbor, every strait, every island was a piece of a greater design. Venice and Genoa believed the design should belong to them alone. The rivalry began in whispers. Venetian and Genoese merchants argued in the markets of the Levant. Ships jostled for position in crowded harbors. Accusations of unfair trade practices sparked small fights that spread through narrow streets. Chroniclers described early tensions as sparks dancing above dry timber. Everyone knew they would ignite something greater. Neither side wanted peace, if peace meant surrendering even a small advantage. Each believed the other was gaining ground. Each believed the other was obstructing rightful opportunity. Competition grew sharper. Edges hardened. Over time, the conflict took on a shape larger than the ambitions of individual traders. It became a matter of identity. For Venetians, the sea was a sanctuary and a destiny. The Republic was a floating world sustained by saltworks, shipyards, and 1,000 connections to the east. Without maritime supremacy, Venice would wither. For Genoese citizens, the sea was a challenge and a promise. Their rugged homeland offered little farmland but endless potential for those who dared to leave its shores. A Genoese sailor could become rich beyond imagination if his city retained its influence. He could also return home with nothing if Venice gained control of the ports that mattered. As both republics expanded, each watched the other with a mixture of fear and contempt. Whenever Venice formed a treaty with Byzantium, Genoa felt threatened. Whenever Genoa secured a foothold in the Black Sea, Venice felt cornered. Whenever one city built faster galleys, the other responded with more shipyards and more innovation. Progress was never neutral. Every improvement in naval design was a weapon disguised as advancement. Every commercial treaty was a territorial claim. Every hire of a new mercenary captain carried the smell of the next war. The Mediterranean world was changing quickly. Constantinople was rising again after its chaotic years under Latin rule. The Mongol Empire was reshaping trade routes farther east. The Crusader states were fracturing and reorganizing. Muslim powers in North Africa were expanding. In this shifting web of alliances and rivalries, Venice and Genoa sought advantage wherever they could find it. Their diplomats negotiated in courts from Cairo to Trebizond. Their merchants spied on each other in silent corners of distant bazaars. Their admirals studied new techniques for naval combat with the seriousness of men who knew that a single innovation might decide the next century. In many ways, this rivalry was a reflection of the age. The Middle Ages were not a quiet world. They were dynamic and harsh, filled with people who lived close to hunger and closer still to ambition. A single cargo of spices could make a merchant wealthy enough to influence politics. A single lost ship could ruin him. Wealth depended on risk, and risk depended on mastery of the sea. For both Venice and Genoa, fortune rose and fell on the crests of their galleys. The earliest conflicts between them were small but revealing. A burned warehouse in Acre, a seized cargo in Constantinople, a brawl involving sailors who refused to yield docking rights. But these small conflicts grew. Communities rallied behind their citizens abroad. Retaliation became duty. Pride became policy. Soon the two republics were supporting rival factions across the eastern Mediterranean. A quarrel between traders turned into a struggle between states. War became inevitable, and once it began, it returned again and again. Each conflict scarred the world around it. Entire neighborhoods in Acre were destroyed during their first large-scale confrontation. Merchants fled. Crusaders were forced to choose sides. Interventions came from Byzantium, from the papacy, from Aragon, and from numerous Italian states. Every power that had something to gain or lose in the Mediterranean eventually stepped into the dispute. This was no longer a rivalry. It was a geopolitical storm. Generations grew up with the knowledge that another war might begin before they reached adulthood. Sailors told their sons that the enemy waited beyond the horizon. Merchants counted their profits with one eye on their ships, praying that a rival fleet did not intercept them. Leaders in both republics argued constantly over strategy. Some hoped to negotiate a lasting peace, yet the slightest sign of weakness from one side encouraged boldness from the other. It was a cycle fueled by suspicion and resentment. But for all the tension, there was also brilliance. This was an age of extraordinary shipbuilding. Both cities developed faster galleys, smarter naval tactics, and financial institutions capable of supporting long campaigns. Bankers in Genoa perfected instruments that influenced later European banking. Venetian state shipyards created one of the most sophisticated production systems in the medieval world. Innovation often springs from pressure, and nowhere was pressure greater than in this rivalry. The conflict shaped not only technology, but culture. Songs were written about heroes who fought on the sea. Stories spread through taverns about victories and disasters. Chroniclers recorded every major engagement, sometimes exaggerating the triumphs of their own city, sometimes lamenting the losses with the weight of personal grief. Citizens carried deep pride in their identity. They believed their republic was chosen to dominate the Mediterranean, and that belief strengthened their resolve. Time did not ease the rivalry, it expanded it. By the 14th century, the two republics were involved in increasingly larger military operations. Their fleets roamed from the Adriatic to the Black Sea. They laid siege to fortified ports, they captured islands, disrupted each other's trade networks. The rivalry reached its peak in the dramatic struggle known as the War of Chioggia, a conflict that nearly destroyed Venice entirely. Only desperate measures and extraordinary leadership prevented the Republic from collapsing into the sea. The long contest between Genoa and Venice left deep marks on the Mediterranean world. It altered the course of commerce, shaped the fall and rise of cities. It influenced the fate of Constantinople and the emergence of powers that would dominate the coming centuries. It taught Europe that maritime supremacy required more than courage. It required organization, innovation, patience, and an understanding that war was not always fought with swords. Often it was fought with trade agreements, embargoes, loans, and influence. The story of these 191 years is the story of ambition without rest, competition without pause, and two cities that believed their survival depended on victory. It is a story of fleets that burned under the noon sun, of captains who gambled everything on the turn of a tide, and of merchants who lived by a single truth: power belonged to whoever controlled the sea. This documentary will follow that truth from its beginnings to its end. It will travel from the narrow alleys of Genoa to the broad plazas of Venice. It will trace the rise of great admirals, the fall of great colonies, and the constant pressure that pushed both republics into repeated conflict. And it will show how the rivalry became a force that shaped not only the medieval world, but the foundations of the modern age. The story now turns toward the broader world that created this conflict and the forces that sustained it for nearly 2 centuries. The medieval Mediterranean was a world in constant motion. It was a sea crossed by merchants, pilgrims, envoys, soldiers, slaves, spices, and silk. Every shore carried its own story, from the rising towers of Italian cities to the fortified ports of the Levant. Across its waters moved wealth that sustained kingdoms and nourished growing republics. Whoever mastered these routes held not only riches but influence over the balance of power in Europe. Medieval chroniclers wrote that the sea was a living force, drawing nations into contact and conflict. It shaped identities as surely as it shaped coastlines. It was in this world of ceaseless trade and competition that Venice and Genoa rose to prominence. Both began as communities of traders who built their lives around the sea. Venice rose from lagoon settlements formed by refugees seeking safety from invasions on the mainland. Its early generations understood hardship and resilience. The lagoon made defense natural but expansion a challenge. To thrive, the Venetians embraced commerce with a determination that surprised larger and older powers. By the 12th century, Venice had become a political marvel. It was governed by a complex system of councils and magistrates that diluted personal ambition while empowering collective goals. Its merchant families formed a disciplined ruling class devoted to trade. Their power was steady rather than flamboyant. Chroniclers described Venice as quiet in its pride, yet relentless in its pursuit of profit. Genoa emerged along the Ligurian coast, a city of steep hills and sheltered inlets. From the beginning, it had a different character. Its people were known for independence, daring, and fierce local loyalty. Political authority shifted between competing families whose rivalries sometimes erupted into open violence. Yet despite these internal struggles, or perhaps because of them, the Genoese became brilliant sailors and negotiators. Their merchant houses learned to operate in dangerous environments where adaptability often meant survival. Genoa built a network of colonies and trading rights from the Western, its Mediterranean to the Black Sea. Its spirit was bold and outward-looking. Chroniclers often compared the Genoese mind to the sea wind, unpredictable yet powerful. Both republics understood that maritime trade was the key to prosperity. Goods from distant lands traveled by caravan to ports in the eastern Mediterranean, where Italian merchants purchased them for transport to Europe. Spices, silk, cotton, sugar, and precious metals brought immense returns. Each cargo represented months of planning and enormous risk. Pirates hunted the sea lanes. Political alliances shifted without warning. Storms erased fortunes overnight. Success required organization and innovation. Both Venice and Genoa invested in shipbuilding. Their galleys became models of craftsmanship. They experimented with new construction techniques that allowed for faster travel and heavier cargo. They also built naval fleets capable of protecting merchants and confronting rivals. The Mediterranean itself was divided into regions that shaped these strategies. The Adriatic Sea, narrow and bordered by mountains, was Venice's natural sphere. The city guarded it carefully, treating it as a lifeline. Control of the Adriatic ensured that Venetian ships could move to and from the eastern Mediterranean without interference. Beyond the Adriatic lay the Aegean, a maze of islands that linked Greece with Asia Minor. Whoever held these islands held staging points for larger ventures. The Aegean was contested by Byzantines, Crusaders, and local lords. The Black Sea opened even greater opportunities. Its ports connected to trade routes that reached deep into the Eurasian interior. Grain, fur, slaves, and valuable raw materials flowed from its shores. The Levant added another dimension, the Crusader states, along with powerful Muslim dynasties, created a competitive marketplace where European merchants negotiated for privileges and protections. Venice and Genoa understood that dominance required more than ships and coin. They had to secure agreements from emperors, sultans, kings, and local princes. They built consulates and warehouses in foreign ports. They recruited agents fluent in multiple languages. They learned to navigate the politics of Byzantine courts, Muslim administrations, and Latin Crusader states. Success depended on being present everywhere and trusted by enough local powers to keep doors open. Both republics mastered this art, yet their victories placed them on a collision course. The more one expanded, the more it constrained the other. By the 13th century, their rivalry had become a defining feature of Mediterranean politics. The long conflict between Venice and Genoa did not begin with a single decisive moment. It grew from overlapping ambitions. Each feared that the other would one day control the sea. Each believed that survival depended on preventing that outcome. Chroniclers wrote that these fears were not irrational because both republics were deeply dependent on maritime commerce. Without trade, they would wither. Their ruling classes understood this with absolute clarity. Young merchants grew up hearing that their city lived or died by mastery of the sea. This belief shaped generations. It also ensured that every dispute, no matter how small, felt like the beginning of a larger struggle. Across 191 years, the rivalry erupted into 4 major wars. The first confrontation was a contest for influence in the eastern Mediterranean and the early Crusader states. It set patterns that would repeat again and again. Fleets clashed near islands and peninsulas. Merchant communities in foreign ports fought for privileges and protection. The Second Great Conflict involved Byzantine politics and the rise of the Latin Empire after the Fourth Crusade. Venetian influence grew dramatically, while Genoa sought new alliances to counterbalance this shift. The Third War reached into the Black Sea, where both republics tried to secure access to its lucrative markets. Outposts changed hands. Fortifications were destroyed and rebuilt. The Fourth and Final War became the most intense. It threatened the very existence of both cities. Chroniclers described it in vivid terms, noting the scale of the fleets and the desperation of the combatants. Yet the rivalry was not limited to these open wars. Much of the conflict unfolded indirectly through proxy struggles. Venice and Genoa supported different factions within the Crusader states. They backed rival claimants to Byzantine thrones. They maneuvered in North Africa, where Muslim dynasties granted trading rights that could shift the fortunes of an entire fleet. They intervened in Sicily and Cyprus. They encouraged local rebellions when doing so served their interests. This constant competition created a landscape where almost every Mediterranean dispute had a Venetian or Genoese angle. Their presence was felt from the Straits of Gibraltar to the coast of Crimea. Both republics developed institutions that allowed them to sustain this rivalry across generations. Venice refined its political system to maintain stability, expanded its arsenal, and improved its bureaucratic control over shipbuilding. Its merchant class grew more disciplined. Genoa, although more turbulent, produced extraordinary families whose international networks rivaled those of modern financial houses. These families invested in expeditions, loaned money to rulers, and managed colonies as semi-autonomous enterprises. Their influence extended far beyond the city's walls. The rivalry also accelerated innovation. Naval tactics evolved as commanders confronted new challenges. Galley design improved. Armored towers were added to ships. Crossbowmen became decisive in naval engagements. Administrators developed systems to mobilize fleets quickly and to finance long campaigns. Merchants adopted new accounting methods and partnerships. These innovations had lasting effects. They influenced other European states and helped shape the transition from the medieval world to the early modern era. The outcome of the rivalry was not predetermined. At various moments, Genoa seemed poised to dominate. At other times, Venice appeared unassailable. Both suffered setbacks so severe that chroniclers predicted collapse, yet both adapted. Their ability to recover revealed the strength of their institutions and the determination of their citizens. In the end, Venice emerged as the more stable and enduring power. Its victory did not come through a single moment, but through accumulated advantages created by centuries of disciplined governance and shrewd diplomacy. Genoa remained influential, but its internal divisions weakened its ability to sustain a long strategic contest. This documentary will explore this long arc in detail. It will trace the origins of both republics. It will examine the role of geography, culture, and politics in shaping their identities. It will follow their merchants through the ports of the Aegean and the markets of the Levant. It will uncover the shifting alliances that drew them into contact with emperors, sultans, and crusader kings. It will recount the major wars and the decisions that changed their course. It will explain how each generation inherited the ambitions and fears of the one before it. Over the course of 20 chapters, we will move steadily through this world. We will follow the rise of Venice and Genoa from local powers to global actors in the medieval economy. We will witness the moments of triumph and disaster that defined their rivalry. We will meet the individuals whose lives were shaped by decisions made far from their home ports. This story is not only about fleets and treaties. It is about people who lived beside the sea and believed that it was their path to fortune or ruin. By the end of this journey, we will see how their century-spanning conflict helped shape European history. The rivalry of Venice and Genoa left marks on maps, laws, trade routes, and political institutions. Its echoes continued long after their final confrontation. This documentary invites the viewer to step into that world and witness a struggle that lasted nearly 2 centuries. The seeds of rivalry between Venice and Genoa were planted long before the first open conflict. They took root in the slow transformation of the Mediterranean from a fragmented world into a connected commercial arena. In the early medieval centuries, its waters carried small currents of trade that gradually widened into great arteries linking distant cultures. Caravan routes from the east converged on the Levanten ports where merchants waited with careful patience. From those ports, goods traveled westward to Europe. Flow was not constant. It rose and fell with wars and political upheaval. Yet even in the most turbulent years, the promise of profit drew traders back again and again. It was within this environment that the foundations of Venice and Genoa were shaped. Venice developed under the protective influence of Byzantium. The Byzantine Empire valued the lagoon communities both as loyal subjects and as a buffer against rivals. Over time, Venetian ships gained privileges in imperial harbors. These privileges allowed them to purchase goods at favorable rates and to maintain a presence in eastern waters. The empire relied on their skill and their willingness to navigate difficult routes. In return, Venice received opportunities that would define its early character. Its merchants became interpreters between East and West. They learned the languages of foreign courts. They studied the customs of distant markets. They formed relationships that granted them access to the finest silk and spices that Constantinople could offer. Chroniclers wrote that Venetian merchants walked with confidence through the great markets of the imperial capital because they knew that their city's fortunes were tied to imperial favor. Now, Venice strengthened its ties with the East. Genoa carved its place in the western Mediterranean. During the 9th and 10th centuries, the Ligurian coast suffered repeated Muslim raids that threatened its survival. To defend themselves, the Genoese built walls, organized militias, and learned to fight at sea. These struggles forged a maritime identity rooted in courage and resilience. Victories over corsair fleets created a spirit of independence that endured through centuries. When security improved, Genoa turned its attention outward. The city expanded its trade into Provence, Sardinia, and Sicily. Its ships ventured farther as its merchant houses gained resources. By the 11th century, Genoa had become an energetic commercial republic, whose citizens believed that the sea held limitless opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. Chroniclers recorded that Genoa's captains often took risks that others hesitated to attempt. Their ambition drew them steadily toward the eastern Mediterranean, where Venice already held strong positions. The first encounters between Venetian and Genoese merchants were cautious. Each recognized the other as a capable competitor. They crossed paths in Levantine markets, where Byzantine officials regulated trade with careful precision. These markets were vital to both republics. They provided the spices and luxuries that Europe demanded. They also offered access to ship timber, food supplies, and skilled labor. Venetian merchants were often supported by long-standing agreements with local authorities. Genoese traders relied on their ability to negotiate quickly and adapt to sudden changes. Their strengths differed, and these differences shaped their interactions. At first, the tension remained manageable. The Mediterranean was vast, and its opportunities many. Yet as both republics expanded their fleets and increased their investments, space grew tighter. Each new Venetian warehouse represented a potential threat to Genoese profits. Each new Genoese treaty signaled a future challenge to Venetian bargaining power. The Levant became the earliest stage where rivalry turned into conflict of interest. Merchants competed for favorable storage space, for access to customs officials, and for influence with local rulers. Disputes erupted over taxes and shipping priorities. Chroniclers recount several incidents in which shouting matches escalated into brief skirmishes before authorities intervened. Although these clashes were small, they hinted at a deeper struggle. Constantinople became the center of these rising tensions. The Byzantine capital was the greatest market in the Mediterranean. Its population, wealth, and strategic location made it irresistible to ambitious traders. For Venice, it was the cornerstone of prosperity. Venetian quarters lined its harbors. Their churches and lodgings gave them a sense of permanence. Their privileges were enshrined in imperial decrees. Some emperors even relied on Venetian fleets to secure their coasts. This created resentment among other merchant communities who felt overshadowed by Venetian influence. Genoa recognized that its future depended on establishing a foothold in the city. Genoese merchants began appearing in increasing numbers. They negotiated for their own quarters, privileges, and trading rights. Their presence disrupted the comfortable position Venice had enjoyed for generations. Imperial officials sometimes used Genoese competition to pressure Venice into accepting new terms. At other times, they favored Venice to keep Genoa in check. These shifting policies fueled mistrust. Each republic believed that the other sought to dominate the city's vast markets. The 12th century brought new complications. The Crusades altered the political landscape of the Mediterranean. Ports that had once belonged to Byzantium came under Latin control. Others fell to Muslim dynasties. Trade routes shifted. Opportunities expanded for those with the courage to pursue them. Both Venice and Genoa contributed fleets to crusading armies. Both were rewarded with privileges and colonies in the eastern Mediterranean. These new outposts provided staging grounds for further expansion. They also brought their merchant communities into even closer proximity in Antioch, Acre, Tyre, and other Levantine ports. Venetian and Genoese warehouses often stood within sight of each other. Their markets hummed with activity as merchants sold fine textiles, sugar, cotton, glassware, and spices. Yet beneath this bustle lay growing suspicion. Even simple disagreements over dock access or weights and measures could escalate into heated confrontations. Chroniclers describe episodes in which Venetian guards and Genoese guards drew weapons after quarrels between their respective merchants. Local rulers struggled to maintain order. They relied on the wealth generated by both communities and hesitated to anger either. These growing tensions were not merely the result of personality or pride. They were rooted in deeper economic concerns. Both republics understood that the Mediterranean was entering a new era of commercial expansion. Whoever established dominance in the Levant would gain a decisive advantage over competing European powers. The wealth of these ports could finance fleets, fortify cities, and elevate merchant families to lasting prominence. The stakes were high enough to alter the course of politics. Venetian councils monitored Genoese activity with careful scrutiny. Genoese families studied Venetian trade patterns and invested resources where they believed their rivals were vulnerable. The rivalry entered a sharper phase as both republics sought closer ties with the Byzantine Empire. Venice relied on its long-standing relationship with Constantinople. It had proven its loyalty during past conflicts and expected continued favor. Genoa, however, offered something equally valuable. Its merchants were skilled in financing military expeditions and in transporting supplies. They courted emperors with promises of loans, ships, and alliances. The empire, pressured by threats from the Seljuks and internal instability, often welcomed this assistance. The balance of influence in the capital shifted repeatedly as emperors weighed the advantages of playing one republic against the other. This uncertainty intensified the rivalry. By the middle of the 12th century, the situation had become increasingly volatile. Both Venice and Genoa had expanded their networks throughout the Aegean and the Black Sea. Their ships passed each other frequently. Their agents collected intelligence on political developments and market conditions. Every advantage became a contest. If Venice secured a new privilege in Constantinople, Genoa scrambled to match or surpass it. Genoa acquired a valuable staging point on a distant coast. Venice moved quickly to negotiate its own agreements with local rulers. Constantinople remained the heart of the struggle. Its political climate grew more unpredictable as factions within the court competed for power. Each faction understood the value of foreign support. Venetian and Genoese merchants became entangled in court politics, even when reluctant. As their importance increased, so did the risks. A single decree could expel one community and elevate the other. A single riot could destroy warehouses and end years of investment. Chroniclers describe moments of extreme tension when rumors of imperial displeasure spread through merchant quarters and caused panic. By the end of this period, it was clear that the rivalry had moved beyond competition for profits. It had become a contest for influence, security, and identity. Each republic believed that its future depended on outmaneuvering the other. Each community carried memories of grievances, both real and imagined. Young merchants grew up hearing stories of insults and injustices suffered by their predecessors. These stories influenced their actions when they arrived in foreign ports. The seeds of rivalry had taken root in the minds of generations. The stage was set for conflict on a much larger scale. The next decades would push the rivalry into open confrontation. What had begun as disputes between merchants would become struggles between fleets and governments. The Mediterranean was preparing to witness a long and relentless contest between two rising powers whose ambitions could no longer be contained within the walls of warehouses or the chambers of imperial courts. The 12th century Mediterranean economy was a vast organism driven by the movement of goods, people, and ideas. Its rhythms were influenced by seasonal winds and shifting political powers. It connected North African markets with Italian ports, Byzantine harbors with the trading centers of the Levant, and the caravan routes of the East with the rising cities of Europe. This world rewarded those who could negotiate its complexities and punished those who hesitated. The merchants of Venice and Genoa understood that the stakes had grown higher than ever before. Wealth flowed through the great ports of Syria and Byzantium, with a force that shaped the ambitions of entire republics. Acre and Tyre had become central hubs of this economy. Their warehouses stored spices from Egypt, timber from the mountains of Lebanon, sugar from the plantations of the Crusader states, and fabrics from Persian and Byzantine looms. Their markets attracted merchants from every corner of the Mediterranean. Each transaction relied on agreements between local lords, commercial guilds, and foreign trading communities. These agreements were fragile and vulnerable to disruption. Change in local leadership could alter rules overnight. A sudden victory or defeat on the battlefield could shift alliances that traders depended upon. For Venice, these Levantine ports were essential links in a long chain that connected the Adriatic to the Eastern world. Venetian merchants held established quarters in both Acre and Tyre. Their presence was reinforced by treaties with Crusader rulers who valued the stability and naval resources Venice could provide. Venetian warehouses were known for their efficiency and for the disciplined way in which they managed customs procedures. Chroniclers often noted that Venetian officials kept careful records, ensuring that their income from taxes and fees remained steady. Genoa entered these ports with a different strategy. It relied on family-based merchant houses that specialized in aggressive negotiation and quick adaptation. Genoese traders were willing to take risks that others avoided. They sought deals that promised immediate profit, even if they involved uncertainty. When Genoese captains arrived in Acre and Tyre, they came equipped with letters of introduction from powerful families and with promises of naval assistance to local lords. Crusader rulers saw value in this. Their states were constantly threatened by Muslim armies and by internal rivalries. Alliances with Genoa offered military support in times of danger. Competition between the two republics became more visible as Genoa expanded its interests in these ports. Venetian officials reported that Genoese merchants often attempted to undercut prices or secure preferential treatment through gifts and promises. Genoese chroniclers countered that Venetians used their long-standing privileges to block fair competition. The truth was that both sides acted out of necessity. The markets were too valuable to share peacefully. Each cargo of spices or silk represented months of labor and could determine a merchant's fortunes. Violence began to spread through the merchant colonies. These settlements had their own guards and functioned almost like miniature districts of their home cities. They contained lodgings, shops, warehouses, and small chapels. When disputes erupted, merchants often turned first to their own guards rather than local authorities. Minor incidents escalated quickly. A disagreement over the use of a storage space could lead to destruction of goods. A quarrel during the unloading of a ship could ignite a brawl that pulled dozens into the fight. Chronicles provide vivid accounts of these moments, describing broken stalls, damaged cargo, and frightened locals who had no interest in becoming entangled in foreign quarrels. In Tyre, there were several episodes in which Venetian and Genoese sailors confronted each other after disagreements on the docks. Both communities accused the other of violating established agreements. Genoese captains claimed that Venetian officials demanded excessive fees. Venetians insisted that Genoese merchants attempted to bypass standard customs procedures. These arguments reflected deeper anxieties. Each republic feared losing its place in the hierarchy of Levantine trade. Each believed that a single lost privilege could have long-term consequences for its wider commercial network. The tension was even greater in Acre. The city served as the capital of the remaining Crusader territories and functioned as the main entry point for goods destined for Europe. Its political landscape was complex. Crusader factions competed for influence, while local bishops and military orders shaped policy. Venetian and Genoese communities learned to navigate this delicate environment, forming alliances with different groups depending on circumstances. This contributed to the spread of violence. When one faction in the city favored Venice, Genoa aligned with its rivals. When power shifted, the reverse occurred. Local disputes became international confrontations as each republic attempted to protect its interests. In one recorded incident, a confrontation over a warehouse in Acre escalated into street fighting. Venetian guards attempted to secure the building after receiving information that Genoese merchants planned to move goods through it without paying required fees. Genoese sailors intervened. The resulting clashes led to injuries, damages, and a brief shutdown of nearby markets. Local officials were forced to impose strict measures to restore order. Although the conflict ended without major casualties, it signaled that commercial rivalry had crossed into open hostility. At the same time, disputes were unfolding in Byzantine ports. Constantinople remained the greatest and most influential trading center in the Mediterranean. Its politics were famously intricate and often unpredictable. Merchant communities lived in a constant state of vigilance. A new emperor could alter trading privileges with a single decree. Court politics could determine whether a republic prospered or suffered losses. Venice held long-established agreements that protected its merchants from sudden changes. Genoa sought similar concessions, but struggled against Venetian influence. Genoese merchants expanded their activities in the Aegean and Black Sea regions. They sought opportunities on islands and in coastal towns where imperial authority was weaker, hoping to build influence that could later be used to negotiate improved rights in Constantinople. Venice responded by strengthening its ties with imperial officials and by increasing its naval presence in the region. These maneuvers brought the two republics into greater conflict. Even small seizures of property or brief confrontations between patrol ships contributed to the rising sense that the Mediterranean was entering a new phase of instability. As these tensions spread across the sea, both republics began forming alliances with the Crusader states. These states were constantly threatened by surrounding powers and depended on external support. Venice offered fleets and logistical aid. Genoa offered soldiers, ships, and loans. Crusader rulers often favored whichever republic provided the most immediate assistance. Their choices created friction. If a Crusader town granted special privileges to Genoa, the Venetian authorities viewed it as an affront. If a port favored Venice, Genoa feared being pushed out entirely. These alliances had long-term consequences. They linked the commercial interests of the republics to the political fortunes of the Crusader states. Every shift in power among the Crusader lords affected Venetian and Genoese merchants. The republics used diplomacy and military aid to shape decisions in these states. Chroniclers noted that merchant envoys attended court gatherings where alliances were debated. They influenced decisions about port regulations, shipping rights, and taxation. The rivalry expanded beyond commerce into wider political affairs. By the late 12th century, the first open clashes had made it clear that competition had transformed into a broader struggle for dominance. The Mediterranean economy had grown so large and interconnected that setbacks in one region could affect trade across the entire sea. Venice and Genoa recognized that they were not simply defending local interests. They were fighting for their positions in an evolving world. Their merchant colonies became extensions of state policy. Their fleets became tools of negotiation. Their alliances shaped political outcomes that would resonate for decades. The transformation of rivalry into active conflict marked the beginning of a pattern that would repeat across generations. Disputes in ports and markets were no longer isolated events. They were signs of a deeper contest for influence. The republics watched each other with growing suspicion. Every agreement, every treaty, and every new alliance was viewed through the lens of long-term strategy. Both Venice and Genoa believed that the future of the Mediterranean would be decided by their actions. They also understood that the path ahead would be filled with confrontation. The first open clashes formed the early echoes of wars yet to come. They revealed the resolve of both republics to defend and expand their interests. They showed the lengths to which merchants would go to secure profit and protection. It demonstrated the growing involvement of governments in commercial disputes. The Mediterranean was becoming a battleground where fleets and alliances carried the weight of national survival. The era of minor quarrels was ending. The age of organized conflict was beginning. The years that followed the War of Saint Sabas did not bring peace to the Mediterranean. They produced a silence that felt tense and temporary, a pause in which both Venice and Genoa nursed injuries, rebuilt fleets, and studied the weaknesses revealed in their enemy. Acre had shown the world how far the two republics were willing to go for control of commerce. It had shown that even the holiest city in the Crusader East could become a battleground when profit and reputation were at stake. The war ended with Venetian triumph, yet no one on either side believed the matter settled. The conflict had not exhausted the rivalry. It had only clarified the stakes. In this new period, trade expanded, ideas circulated more widely, and naval design grew more sophisticated. But beneath the surface of a rapidly changing world, the embers of hostility continued to glow. The ports of the Eastern Mediterranean became arenas where every small incident could escalate into another confrontation. Merchants and sailors carried with them stories of grievances that grew sharper with each retelling. The rival republics fought through economics, diplomacy, and the constant threat of renewed violence. It was during these decades that the paths of Venice and Genoa moved steadily toward a far larger collision, one that would eventually bring both states to the brink of destruction. The fall of Acre in 1291 reshaped the commercial map of the Mediterranean. With the final collapse of the Crusader states, the old Levantan entrepôts were lost, and the republics were forced to look elsewhere. Genoa directed its gaze to the Black Sea. Venetian merchants focused on consolidating their power in Crete, Cyprus, and the Aegean channels that led into the eastern routes. The loss of Acre had removed the primary battleground of the previous century, but it did not remove the rivalry. Instead, it forced the competition into new waters. Every shift in influence became magnified because the available commercial ground had narrowed. Fewer ports meant more intense disputes. In the wake of Acre's destruction, Genoa took advantage of its strong position in the Black Sea. The city of Kaffa became a jewel of Genoese enterprise. It was a place where caravans from the Mongol domains met the merchants of Europe, a place where grain, fur, slaves, and precious goods flowed westward. Genoa's prosperity in these years created pride, but also anxiety. Venetian observers watched these developments with unease. They feared that if left unchecked, Genoa would gain control of a region vital for supplying grain to Italy and for linking east and west. The competition for influence in the Black Sea would repeatedly pull the two republics into confrontation, sometimes involving distant powers that barely understood the origins of the conflict. Venice responded by strengthening its presence in the Aegean. It asserted control over key islands and established itself as the dominant naval force in the Adriatic. The Venetian Senate saw the Adriatic as its lifeline, a corridor through which all trade could safely pass. Any intrusion by Genoa into these waters was interpreted as an existential threat. The Adriatic formed the heart of Venetian identity. It was not simply a commercial route, it was the Republic's shield. Genoa understood this and did not hesitate to test the boundaries. Even a small Genoese convoy passing too close to Venetian waters could provoke outrage in the Great Council. These tensions shaped diplomatic relations across Europe. Both Venice and Genoa sent ambassadors from court to court, promoting alliances and promising benefits to kings and dukes who sided with them. The rivalry spread into France, Aragon, Sicily, and the Byzantine Empire. Each republic gained friends not because they shared ideals, but because rulers saw advantage in choosing one side over the other. The Mediterranean had become a chessboard. The cities of Italy were the pieces. The monarchs of Europe were the ones who moved them according to their own advantage. Nowhere was this manipulation more visible than in the crumbling Byzantine Empire. Constantinople, which had once commanded the seas and dictated terms to both Venice and Genoa, had become a state desperately seeking allies. Its emperors invited the Italian republics to support them in exchange for commercial rights. Genoa thrived in this environment and secured trading privileges that tilted the balance of power in its favor. Venice viewed these agreements as hostile acts, designed to undermine its influence in the Eastern Mediterranean. The memory of the Venetian triumph during the Fourth Crusade still lingered in Byzantine minds and shaped how emperors distributed their favors. Genoa seized the opportunity to present itself as the empire's indispensable partner. The tensions grew sharper in the early 14th century, when internal conflicts among Italian states created new fronts in the rivalry. Florence, Pisa, Lucca, and Milan became involved in disputes that drew in Venetian and Genoese interests. Every local Italian war had the potential to become a proxy struggle between the republics. Friends of Venice found themselves facing the friends of Genoa. Cities that attempted neutrality risked being pulled into the conflict through economic pressure. The result was a Mediterranean world riddled with overlapping tensions and overlapping alliances. The rivalry became part of the political DNA of the region. Some of the most dramatic scenes of this period unfolded around the island of Cyprus. Cyprus stood at the crossroads of Mediterranean commerce. Whoever controlled Cyprus controlled the gateway to the east. Genoa made early gains on the island, securing influence in its markets and establishing a relationship with the local kings. Venice answered by sending its own merchants and diplomats, determined to prevent any one power from dominating the island. Small fights broke out in the harbors. Trade disputes escalated into violent confrontations. The kings of Cyprus attempted to balance the competing interests, but their choices inevitably angered one side or the other. It was on Cyprus that the seeds were planted for a future crisis. Genoa's victory in the commercial disputes of the island emboldened its leaders. They believed Venice was weakening. The Venetians, however, did not view these setbacks as permanent. They invested more heavily in shipbuilding and naval infrastructure. They recruited experienced commanders and prepared for what many in the Senate believed was inevitable. Both republics lived with the sense that they were approaching a turning point. The trade world had become too narrow, the political world too tense, and the memory of old conflicts too vivid. A major war felt unavoidable. Throughout this period of rising tensions, naval technology advanced rapidly. The design of galleys became more refined. The need for speed, maneuverability, and carrying capacity drove innovation. Genoese shipyards attempted to produce larger cargo vessels to dominate long-range trade. Venetian craftsmen concentrated on creating faster and more agile war galleys. The arms race on the sea was relentless. Every improvement by one side pushed the other to respond. Commanders studied the battles of earlier decades. They sought ways to counter the tactics that had brought victory to their rivals. Fleet organization became more strategic. The republics began to experiment with mixed forces of galleys and heavy transport ships. They drilled crews more rigorously, knowing that sea battles were often won through discipline rather than brute force. Behind the scenes, espionage grew into a powerful instrument. Spies infiltrated merchant colonies, shipyards, and even government councils. Secrets about shipbuilding, trade deals, and naval deployments became valuable commodities. Letters were intercepted, messengers disappeared, information moved along hidden channels, shaping the strategies of both states. Suspicion became part of everyday life for merchants and sailors. Anyone seen speaking with a foreigner risked being accused of passing secrets to the enemy. The governments of both republics claimed they acted in defense of national security. In truth, they acted because the rivalry left little room for trust. By the mid-14th century, the Mediterranean had become a pressure chamber. Venice and Genoa entered a period that historians later described as an age of strained peace. It was a peace in name only. A single spark could ignite a new war. That spark came in the form of shifting alliances in northern Italy. Milan, rising as a regional power, supported Genoa and threatened to dominate the Po Valley. Venice saw this as a direct strategic threat and prepared to oppose Milan's expansion. The conflict drew Genoa and Venice once more into direct opposition. The final push toward large-scale war came when Genoa gained control of the strategic city of Chioggia in the Venetian lagoon. This act was not the beginning of the war. It was the culmination of decades of escalating tensions. It was the moment when the rivalry reached its breaking point. The capture of Chioggia shocked Venice. It forced the Republic to recognize that its very survival was at stake. The generations of merchants, sailors, diplomats, and commanders who had lived with the rivalry were now witnesses to its decisive phase. The Mediterranean had entered the period that would give rise to the War of Chioggia, one of the most dramatic and consequential confrontations in medieval history. The years that followed the violence in Acre carried with them the illusion of calm, but beneath that surface, the rivalry between Genoa and Venice continued to grow in intensity. The War of Saint Sabas had left scars on both republics. It had reshaped trade routes, broken alliances, and revealed how deeply each state was willing to wound the other for the sake of commercial advantage. Yet neither side emerged from the conflict prepared to relinquish its ambitions. The Mediterranean, always a landscape of shifting currents and shifting loyalties, soon presented new opportunities for confrontation. What looked like peace was little more than a pause between clashes. The most significant development of this period began in the Byzantine world. The Latin Empire, created after the sack of Constantinople in the early 13th century, had weakened gradually, losing territory and political unity. The Greeks of Nicaea, led by the ambitious Michael VIII Palaiologos, sought to reclaim their ancient capital. The struggle for Constantinople became the stage upon which Venice and Genoa re-entered their rivalry. Both republics understood that whatever state controlled the city would control a keystone of Mediterranean commerce. Constantinople linked Europe and Asia. It connected the Black Sea and the Aegean. It offered privileges, exemptions, and vast opportunities to whichever trading power stood in favor with its rulers. Michael VIII recognized the importance of foreign allies. He approached the Italian republics not because he admired them, but because he needed their fleets. The Venetians had long held influence within the city. They had been central to the creation of the Latin Empire. They had established themselves in its harbors and markets. Their privileges had shaped its economic life. If Michael VIII attempted to retake the city without foreign support, the Latin authorities could easily receive reinforcements from Venice. Genoa sensed the moment and moved swiftly. Its merchants and diplomats assured the emperor that they would provide naval aid against the Latin rulers. They offered more than ships. They offered the possibility of shifting the balance of commercial power in the eastern Mediterranean. The emperor accepted Genoa's support. This decision would shape the politics of the region for decades. The alliance granted Genoa generous trading rights in the Black Sea and access to prime locations within Constantinople itself. When Michael VIII successfully recaptured the city in 1261, he rewarded Genoa with extensive privileges. The Genoese established themselves in the suburb of Galata. They built warehouses, docks, and fortifications, turning the settlement into a thriving commercial hub. Their influence grew rapidly, dominated the traffic from the Black Sea, controlling the goods that flowed from the Mongol territories. They negotiated new agreements with the restored Byzantine court. For a time, it seemed as if Genoa had secured a decisive upper hand. Venice viewed these developments with alarm. The loss of influence in Constantinople struck at the heart of its identity. Venetian merchants had long considered the city an essential pillar of their world. It was the place where East and West met. It was the place where Venetian fleets had once commanded the harbors. The thought of being pushed aside by Genoa felt unbearable. The Senate feared that the new alliance between the emperor and Genoa would erase what Venice had built over generations. This fear grew into resentment, and that resentment would soon translate into preparation for renewed conflict. The return of Byzantine rule brought not stability, but a reordering of alliances across the Mediterranean. Every kingdom watched the shift in Constantinople and considered its implications. France, Aragon, and Sicily eyed the developments with interest. They understood that whoever dominated the Aegean would influence broader continental politics. Venice began to cultivate new diplomatic relationships as a counterweight to Genoese ascendants. It turned to friendly rulers in the Adriatic and sought to strengthen ties with the Crusader outposts that remained scattered through the Levant. Genoa did the same, courting powers that had their own reasons to oppose Venetian influence. During these years, the rivalry between the republics grew increasingly tied to the fate of the Byzantine Empire. Each new decision from the court of Michael VIII had repercussions along every major trade route. When the emperor granted Genoa deeper rights in the Black Sea trade, Venetian merchants protested. When he offered Venice minor concessions in an attempt to keep relations balanced, Genoa responded with suspicion and anger. The Byzantines were caught in the center of this contest. They attempted to maintain the appearance of neutrality. They attempted to use the rivalry as a tool for negotiation. In reality, they had created a situation in which neither republic believed the empire could act without hidden motive. These tensions were not confined to court diplomacy. They spilled into the harbors and markets of the eastern Mediterranean. Venetian and Genoese merchants lived side by side in ports such as Constantinople, Pira, Crete, and the remaining Crusader cities. Their warehouses stood near one another. Their fleets often arrived and departed on the same tides. Their sailors drank in the same taverns and fought in the same streets. Every insult risked becoming a spark. Every brawl risked igniting a fire. Governors and harbor officials attempted to keep order, but their efforts rarely lasted. Local authorities feared the consequences of angering either republic. They imposed temporary fines, temporary separations, and temporary rules. None of these solutions addressed the underlying animosity. The 14th century introduced new pressures. Genoa, strengthened by its relationship with the Byzantine court, increased its naval presence in the Aegean and the Black Sea. Venetian officials believed these actions were part of a broader strategy to encircle them. They feared that Genoa intended to push them entirely out of the east. Genoa denied such claims, but their expanding influence told another story. They built fortified bases. They negotiated with local island lords. They sent embassies into regions where Venice had traditionally held dominance. To Venice, every move by Genoa appeared as preparation for a future confrontation. Venice responded by reinforcing its own positions. In Crete, a vital cornerstone of its maritime empire, the Venetians strengthened their fortifications and reorganized their local administration. They granted privileges to merchants willing to expand trade networks in the eastern Mediterranean. They invested in shipyards that could produce fleets quickly in case of emergency. The Republic's political leaders understood that losing the Aegean would threaten their entire economic system. They urged unity within the Great Council. They emphasized the need for vigilance. They reminded the public that Genoa would not hesitate to exploit any sign of Venetian weakness. While the two states maneuvered for position, the Mediterranean continued to present new crises that shaped the course of the rivalry. Piracy grew more common. Unstable kingdoms sought financial support. The remaining Crusader states faced increasing pressure from surrounding forces. Venice and Genoa each used these challenges to advance their interests. They offered ships and loans to rulers who then felt indebted to them. They provided protection in exchange for commercial privileges. Every agreement made with one republic seemed to offend the other. The region became a web of obligations and resentments. At times, both states recognized the danger of allowing the rivalry to spiral out of control. Temporary truces were negotiated. These truces were designed to create breathing room, not lasting peace. They lasted for months, or sometimes a few years. They were often broken by incidents at sea. A Genoese captain might accuse a Venetian merchant of cheating him in a contract. A Venetian patrol might stop a Genoese vessel sailing near the Adriatic. A misunderstanding in a distant port might trigger new hostilities. When these events occurred, ambassadors delivered formal complaints. Councils debated the meaning of each accusation. Each side claimed innocence and blamed the other for provoking conflict. The uneasy truces did not prevent preparations for war. Both republics continued to expand their fleets. Shipbuilders experimented with new methods to give their vessels greater speed and endurance. Naval commanders studied the tactics used in earlier confrontations. They examined the failures in Acre and reviewed the victories in earlier centuries. They sought ways to improve coordination between squadrons and to maintain control over large fleets spread across vast distances. The sea demanded discipline, and the republics understood that the next conflict would test the full extent of their maritime abilities. Genoa relied heavily on its network of merchants and bankers for funding. Wealthy families contributed resources to the construction of galleys. They expected political influence in return. Venice relied on its centralized structure. The Great Council approved expenditures, and the arsenal carried out construction with remarkable efficiency. Both systems proved effective. Both produced fleets capable of challenging the other. The rivalry had entered a phase where economic power and naval strength were inseparable. Year by year, the tension continued to rise. The Byzantine court grew increasingly unstable. Michael VIII faced internal opposition and external threats. His successors struggled to maintain the empire's fragile balance. Every weakness in Constantinople created opportunities for Venice and Genoa to assert themselves more aggressively. Neither state could afford to let the other dominate the region. The Mediterranean world watched as their rivalry approached a breaking point. The period between the flames of past wars and the truces that never fully held formed the bridge between one era of conflict and the next. The alliances forged in Constantinople, the growing naval pressure across the Aegean, and the anxiety felt in both republics prepared the stage for a confrontation far greater than any that had come before. The republics entered this new phase convinced that only a decisive victory could settle the conflict. The world around them sensed that the Mediterranean was moving toward another storm, one that would shake the foundations of both Genoa and Venice. By the closing years of the 13th century, tensions between Venice and Genoa had escalated to a point where diplomacy could no longer contain the rivalry. Minor skirmishes and disputes in distant ports had evolved into a fully fledged naval war that would determine control of the eastern Mediterranean for decades. The Second Venetian-Genoese War erupted in 1294, bringing fleets to confront one another on waters that had long been the lifeblood of both republics. This was a conflict of ambition and survival, fought with galleys, crossbowmen, and the weight of centuries of accumulated grievances. The war began with clashes in the Adriatic and quickly spread to the waters off the coast of the Levant. Both republics recognized that the stakes were nothing less than access to the trade routes that connected Europe with Asia. Venice sought to protect its established positions in Crete, Cyprus, and the Aegean, while Genoa aimed to expand its influence in the Black Sea and the eastern ports, challenging Venetian dominance wherever opportunity arose. Each fleet carried merchants, soldiers, and the pride of their respective cities. The commanders understood that every engagement would ripple far beyond the immediate battlefield. One of the most decisive encounters occurred at Curzola in 1298. Venetian chroniclers describe the fleet as a formidable array of galleys, moving with precision and discipline. Genoese ships met them with equal numbers and fierce determination. The battle was chaotic and brutal. Oars splintered, sails tore, and fires broke out across decks laden with supplies and cargo. Soldiers clashed with swords and crossbows while the water ran red with blood from men swept overboard. Chroniclers wrote of entire squadrons captured, of brave captains thrown into captivity, and of the confusion that reigned amid the smoke and the screams. The Genoese claimed victory, asserting control over key maritime routes for a time. Venetian losses were heavy, and the Republic's reputation suffered, though it would recover in the years to come. The conflict extended beyond the battlefield to the cities themselves. Merchant communities became theaters of intrigue, espionage, and sabotage. Genoese and Venetian agents operated in ports across the Mediterranean, reporting on fleet movements, stockpiles of supplies, and political sentiment among local rulers. Agreements with local authorities were constantly tested, with each republic attempting to secure advantages at the expense of the other. Traders and artisans were caught in the middle, forced to navigate a world where a single misstep could lead to imprisonment, confiscation of property, or worse. The economic consequences of this war were as significant as the military ones. Markets faltered under uncertainty. Merchants feared moving goods. Insurance costs rose. The Mediterranean felt the tension in every harbor and warehouse. Amid these upheavals, a single Venetian figure emerged in the historical record in a manner that underscored the personal costs of the conflict. Marco Polo, the famous traveler and merchant, was captured during one of the naval engagements and imprisoned in Genoa. His incarceration lasted several years, during which he dictated stories of his travels and observations to fellow prisoners and scribes. The capture of Polo exemplified the intertwining of individual fortunes and grand strategic struggles. It also demonstrated the unpredictability of a war in which even the most experienced navigators could find themselves at the mercy of the enemy. The war also brought temporary Genoese dominance in the Levant. Genoa managed to secure control over key trading posts, exacting favorable terms from local rulers, and establishing bases that enhanced its influence in Syria and the Black Sea. Venetian merchants were forced to adapt, seeking alternative routes and relying on diplomatic channels to maintain some presence. This period of Genoese advantage was celebrated in Genoa, but it was not without costs. The expense of sustaining fleets, paying soldiers, and maintaining distant outposts strained the Republic's finances. Families within the ruling oligarchy debated priorities, and factions formed around strategies for further expansion or cautious consolidation. Venice, meanwhile, faced internal turmoil. The loss at Curzola and the pressure of maintaining multiple theaters of operation led to political infighting. The Great Council and other governing bodies debated the best course of action. Some argued for immediate retaliation to restore Venetian prestige. Others cautioned against overextension, warning that further losses could threaten the Republic's survival. Despite these debates, Venice maintained its focus on rebuilding its fleet, pairing economic networks, and safeguarding crucial positions in the Adriatic. The Republic's ability to recover reflected the resilience of its institutions. and the discipline of its merchant class, which understood that the survival of Venice depended on coordinated action and long-term planning. The war's conclusion in 1299 did not produce a decisive resolution. Genoa retained some of its gains, particularly in the Levant, but Venice remained resilient in its maritime core and in the Adriatic. Both republics suffered losses in ships, men, and wealth. The war had demonstrated the vulnerabilities of even the most carefully maintained empires of trade. It also reinforced the sense that neither republic could afford complacency. Venice and Genoa learned that the rivalry would not end with a single conflict. Instead, it would continue to shape the Mediterranean for generations, with victories and defeats measured in fleets, wealth, and reputation as much as in territory. The Second Venetian-Genoese War illustrates the interplay between naval power, commerce, and politics in the medieval Mediterranean. It highlights the lengths to which both republics would go to defend and expand their interests. It reveals the strategic importance of ports, trade routes, and diplomatic alliances. It shows how individuals like Marco Polo could be caught in the currents of grand events, their fates intertwined with the ambitions of cities and states. Most importantly, it sets the stage for subsequent conflicts, demonstrating that the rivalry was not a series of isolated events, but a continuous struggle driven by ambition, fear, and the pursuit of commercial supremacy. By the end of the war, both republics recognized that maritime dominance required constant vigilance. Genoa's temporary supremacy in certain regions underscored the effectiveness of strategy and timing, while Venice's recovery illustrated the resilience of disciplined institutions and careful planning. The conflict had left its mark on the Mediterranean world, influencing trade, diplomacy, and naval innovation. It also demonstrated that no victory was ever permanent, and no defeat ever final. The long shadow of rivalry stretched ahead, promising new confrontations and new shifts in the balance of power. The Second Venetian-Genoese War also reinforced a lesson that would echo throughout the centuries, that in the Mediterranean, commerce and conflict were inseparable. Every port held potential wealth, every fleet represented both protection and threat, and every alliance could change the fortunes of states overnight. The republics of Venice and Genoa had entered an age in which their survival depended not only on their ability to fight, but on their ability to adapt, to rebuild, and to anticipate the strategies of an ever-resourceful adversary. This period of warfare, capture, and negotiation exemplified the reality of a rivalry that was as much about endurance and ingenuity as it was about the clash of arms. The stage was now set for a new century of confrontation. The experiences of the Second War would inform commanders, politicians, and merchants for decades. Every decision would be weighed against the memory of naval victories and losses, of prisoners held and freed, of fortunes gained and squandered. Would again bear witness to the relentless contest between Venice and Genoa, a contest that would continue to define the region and shape the course of history. The war that ended in 1299 left both Venice and Genoa battered but far from broken. Ships had been sunk, warehouses burned, and merchants imprisoned. Yet each republic emerged determined to maintain its claims and rebuild its influence. The exhaustion of decades of open conflict created a fragile peace, breathing space in which both sides could recover, but it was a peace fraught with tension. The Mediterranean had not forgotten the clash. Every port, every harbor, every trade route still carried the echoes of fleets firing, of sailors captured, and of merchants negotiating under duress. Venice, with its fleet partially replenished and its Adriatic bases secure, looked outward. The eastern Mediterranean remained vital to the Republic's survival. Crete and Cyprus offered staging grounds for trade into the Levant, and control over the Aegean was essential for maintaining influence over commerce traveling toward the Black Sea. The Republic sought to rebuild its trading networks while monitoring Genoese activity. Venetian officials understood that Genoa's ambitions had only grown. The experience of the Second War had proven the effectiveness of Genoese naval strategy and their ability to exploit temporary advantages. Venice needed to anticipate the next moves in order to protect both trade and prestige. Genoa, for its part, turned its attention northward to the Black Sea. The Crimea offered strategic advantages that could alter the balance of Mediterranean trade. From its fortress colonies along the coast, Genoa established strongholds at Caffa, Soldea, and other key ports. These settlements allowed Genoese merchants to control the flow of grain, furs, slaves, and luxury goods from the Mongol domains into Europe. They collected customs duties, regulated the movement of caravans, and maintained garrisons to deter piracy and foreign encroachment. Genoa's investments in the region demonstrated foresight. The Republic understood that dominance in the Black Sea could not only enrich its coffers, but also secure a long-term strategic position against Venice. Venice responded by reinforcing its eastern holdings and seeking alliances to counter Genoese influence. Efforts focused on Crete, where fortifications were improved and garrisons expanded. Venetian diplomats traveled to Cyprus, seeking partnerships with local rulers who could provide both protection and leverage. The Republic also increased its presence in the Aegean, monitoring shipping lanes and trade hubs. Every Genoese maneuver in the Black Sea or along the Aegean coast was noted carefully, and reports were sent to the Senate with recommendations for strategic action. Venice's approach combined military vigilance with commercial acumen, balancing the need for immediate security against the imperative of long-term economic stability. Rivalry in the Black Sea, however, introduced new complications. Genoa's colonies came into contact with the territories of the Mongol Golden Horde, whose rulers controlled the steppe and important trade routes leading westward. Both Venice and Genoa relied on the movement of goods through these lands, but political instability or sudden raids by Mongol factions could disrupt commerce. The republics had to navigate delicate diplomacy, offering gifts and payments to ensure safe passage, while also competing to secure exclusive agreements with local khans. Delays in caravan traffic could result in losses worth thousands of ducats. Merchants and military commanders alike understood that the Black Sea was a frontier where both strategy and fortune determined success. In addition to Mongol interactions, both Venice and Genoa increasingly relied on mercenaries to enforce their will. The rise of Catalan and other professional soldiers brought new methods of warfare into the Mediterranean. These troops were experienced, well-equipped, and sometimes difficult to control, but their presence allowed the republics to exert influence over distant territories without deploying fleets constantly. Mercenary leaders negotiated directly with merchants and governors, enforcing contracts, protecting warehouses, and, when necessary, seizing key locations. Their employment signaled a shift in strategy. Naval power alone was no longer sufficient. Control of trade required boots on the ground, fortified settlements, disciplined soldiers capable of operating in multiple theaters. The use of mercenaries, however, introduced risks. Catalan forces were expensive and their loyalty depended on continued payment and opportunity for loot. Both Venice and Genoa learned that mercenary forces could achieve rapid victories but could also create instability. Local populations resented the presence of foreign troops, occasionally resisting with riots or sabotage. The republics had to manage the delicate balance between asserting authority and maintaining economic productivity. Mistakes could provoke backlash and open new fronts for conflict. During this period, trade disruptions were frequent. Caravan routes from the Golden Horde were subject to delays, theft, and political obstruction. Venetian and Genoese merchants each sought to monopolize safe passage, sometimes negotiating directly with Mongol khans, sometimes attempting to outmaneuver one another through clandestine deals. Letters and envoys carried news of intercepted goods, seized caravans, or sudden tolls imposed along the roads. A single delayed shipment could ripple through the Mediterranean, affecting prices, contracts, and the flow of capital. Commercial intelligence became as valuable as fleets, and both republics devoted significant resources to gathering and protecting information. Despite the tensions, the fragile peace allowed both republics to plan long-term strategies. Venice invested in expanding its naval arsenal and strengthening training for sailors. Genoa reinforced its fortress colonies and consolidated its hold over the Black Sea. Both republics recognized that the next outbreak of hostilities was inevitable, but preparation and patience could tilt the balance in their favor. Political leaders in Venice and Genoa encouraged merchants to continue operations even under uncertain conditions, understanding that economic continuity was essential for funding future wars. The period became a test of endurance as well as ingenuity. The expanding rivalry extended beyond military and commercial considerations. Social and political structures within each republic began to adapt to the ongoing pressures. In Genoa, merchant families wielded increasing influence over policy, funding fleets and colonies while demanding representation in decision-making. In Venice, the Great Council, along with its committees and the Doge, faced growing pressure to coordinate military, diplomatic, and economic policy across multiple regions. Governance became a complex enterprise, balancing the interests of elite families, commercial priorities, and the needs of the state. The success of either republic increasingly depended on the ability to harmonize these competing pressures effectively. As the 14th century unfolded, the Mediterranean became a chessboard of overlapping commercial networks, fortress colonies, and fleet movements. Genoa's presence in the Black Sea challenged Venice's dominance in the Adriatic and Eastern Mediterranean. Venetian vigilance and strategic alliances aimed to contain Genoese influence while preserving access to essential trade routes. Catalan mercenaries, Mongol interactions, and political machinations within local rulers' courts made the environment unpredictable. Both republics understood that the rivalry had evolved beyond isolated skirmishes. It had become a systemic contest of endurance, foresight, and influence. By the mid-14th century, the pattern was clear. Genoa had established a stronghold in the Black Sea, extending its commercial reach and fortifying its strategic position. Venice, though temporarily constrained, had secured critical territories in the Aegean and Adriatic. Each republic had demonstrated that its resilience was not solely determined by naval power, but by its capacity to manage complex networks of diplomacy, trade, and military force. The fragile peace, though tenuous, provided lessons in strategy and preparation. It was a calm that masked the inevitability of further conflict, a moment in which both republics consolidated, calculated, and prepared to strike again. Trade disruptions, fortress colonies, and the growing reliance on mercenaries were not simply military or economic phenomena. They were indicators of the evolving nature of the rivalry itself. Venice and Genoa were no longer competing solely in distant ports or along shipping lanes. They were engaged in a multidimensional struggle in which commerce, diplomacy, and military strategy intersected. Every decision, from the deployment of a single galleon to the negotiation of a caravan treaty, carried consequences that could reverberate for decades. The period of fragile peace and expanding rivalry demonstrated the resilience of both republics. Genoa consolidated its Black Sea colonies, leveraging military and diplomatic tools to dominate trade. Venice countered with strategic investments in the Eastern Mediterranean and careful management of alliances. Both republics navigated the complexities of mercenary forces, Mongol diplomacy, and the unpredictability of local authorities. The fragile peace was thus a time of preparation, reflection, and subtle maneuvering, a period in which both Venice and Genoa recognized that the next great conflict was not a matter of if, but when. By the middle of the 14th century, the rivalry between Venice and Genoa had grown far beyond simple competition over trade routes. The republics were locked in a struggle that encompassed diplomacy, commerce, and military might across the entire Mediterranean. Tensions that had simmered for decades finally erupted into the Third Venetian-Genoese War in 1350. The immediate trigger was a dispute in the Aegean Sea, a region critical to both republics for its control of island ports, sea lanes, and access to eastern markets. What might have begun as a minor confrontation quickly escalated into a full-scale conflict that spanned multiple fronts simultaneously. Drawing in allies, mercenaries, and foreign powers, the Aegean had become a densely contested arena. Venetian holdings on key islands were threatened by Genoese attempts to expand influence and intercept trade passing toward the eastern Mediterranean. Small skirmishes between patrols escalated into larger confrontations, each side accusing the other of violating prior treaties. Genoa, confident from its successes in the Black Sea, sought to consolidate control over strategically important islands and harbors. Venice, aware that loss in this region could cripple its commercial network, mobilized its fleets to secure critical choke points and reinforce garrisons. The tension was palpable, and it was clear that a major confrontation was inevitable. Alliances played a decisive role in the war. Genoa courted Aragon, hoping to strengthen its position in the western Mediterranean and gain additional military support. Venice, in turn, sought assistance from Hungary. Leveraging the kingdom's desire to check Genoese influence and expand its own trade, Byzantium, still recovering from internal instability, found itself pulled into the conflict, balancing concessions to both sides to preserve its tenuous authority. Even the emerging Ottoman principalities, although not yet dominant, became players in the background, their raids on Aegean islands influencing naval deployments and strategic calculations. The war was not contained to a single sea or region. It extended from the Adriatic to the Black Sea, from the Aegean to the Levant, and into the Western Mediterranean through proxy conflicts and alliances. One of the most significant engagements occurred in the Bosporus. Venetian and Genoese fleets collided in a complex series of maneuvers designed to control the vital strait linking the Black Sea to the Aegean. The battle was long and intense, with both sides suffering heavy losses. Galleys rammed, boarding parties clashed, and catapults hurled stones across decks. Venetian-Hungarian cooperation proved decisive. The combined forces outmaneuvered Genoese squadrons and secured control of the passage, safeguarding Venetian access to the Black Sea and threatening Genoese trade colonies. Genoa's temporary setback forced the Republic to reevaluate its strategy and regroup along the western coasts of the Aegean. Meanwhile, multiple fronts stretched the capabilities of both republics. Venice had to manage resources in Crete, Cyprus, and the Adriatic, while simultaneously coordinating fleets with Hungarian allies. Genoa struggled to defend the Black Sea colonies, the Western Aegean holdings, and its positions in northern Italy. Communications were slow and often unreliable, making coordination difficult. Commanders relied on pre-arranged signals, messages carried by fast galleys, and the judgment of local captains acting independently. This decentralized approach required disciplined training and an acute understanding of the broader strategic objectives. Mistakes could be catastrophic, and the stakes could not have been higher. Economic consequences accompanied the military engagements. Trade through key choke points slowed dramatically as fleets blocked ports, inspected cargoes, and disrupted caravan routes. Prices for spices, grain, and luxury goods fluctuated wildly. Merchants faced uncertainty over payment, shipment schedules, and contractual obligations. Insurance costs rose dramatically, and some investors withdrew from trade altogether, unwilling to risk their capital in a contested sea. Both republics recognized that economic pressure could be as effective a weapon as armed confrontation, and commerce became another battlefield within the larger war. Internal political pressures added complexity to the conflict. Venice's Great Council debated the allocation of resources, balancing demands for reinforcements in the Aegean with the need to maintain security at home. Genoa's oligarchic families argued over priorities, some advocating continued aggression in the east, while others urged consolidation and protection of existing holdings. Factions emerged, sometimes supporting naval commanders and sometimes criticizing them for indecision or overreach. Political maneuvering at home influenced military decisions abroad, and vice versa. The war was not only fought on the waves, but within council chambers, palaces, and the homes of the ruling elite. The involvement of Hungary proved a turning point in the conflict. Venetian-Hungarian cooperation allowed for coordinated attacks that forced Genoa to cede key positions in the Aegean and reduced its control over some Black Sea routes. This alliance demonstrated the importance of international diplomacy in a conflict that could no longer be managed solely through maritime superiority. Genoa, meanwhile, relied on Aragonese support to secure its western Mediterranean holdings and to disrupt Venetian operations along Italian coasts. Both republics learned that alliances could tip the balance of war, but they also introduced dependencies and obligations that complicated long-term strategy. Mercenaries continued to play a role, particularly in coastal raids and the defense of contested islands. Catalan and other professional troops were employed by both sides, providing flexibility and expertise that regular naval crews could not offer. Their involvement, however, sometimes exacerbated tensions with local populations. Residents of contested ports and islands suffered from looting, taxation, and forced labor. The human cost of the conflict extended beyond the casualties of battle, touching civilians whose livelihoods depended on trade, agriculture, or local industry. Chroniclers noted the suffering caused by raids, blockades, and the movement of armies, emphasizing that the war was fought not only for wealth and power, but at the expense of ordinary lives. By 1355, the war began to draw to a close. Both republics had suffered heavy losses, and the human and economic toll had become unsustainable. Venice retained key positions in the Aegean, strengthened by its alliance with Hungary, while Genoa maintained influence in the Western Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Neither side achieved absolute victory, but the balance of power had shifted in Venice's favor in the Eastern Mediterranean. The war reinforced the understanding that dominance could not be secured by a single fleet or a single battle. Success required coordination, resilience, and the ability to leverage both military and economic instruments across multiple theaters. The Third Venetian-Genoese War demonstrated the evolving nature of Mediterranean warfare. It was no longer sufficient to rely solely on naval strength. Political alliances, mercenary forces, economic disruption, control of strategic choke points, all became integral to the conduct of war. Commanders and statesmen had to think in terms of simultaneous operations, long-term consequences, and the broader strategic environment. The war illustrated that Venice and Genoa were engaged in a competition that spanned decades and encompassed every dimension of Mediterranean power. This conflict also underscored the resilience of both republics. Despite heavy losses, Venice and Genoa rebuilt fleets, reestablished trade routes, and reasserted influence in contested regions. Each republic demonstrated the ability to recover from setbacks, adapt to changing circumstances, and exploit opportunities created by the rivals' weaknesses. The Third War, like those before it, did not resolve the rivalry, but rather deepened it, setting the stage for future confrontations. The war's conclusion allowed Venice to consolidate its influence in the Aegean while preserving access to critical Black Sea trade. Genoa, though temporarily contained in the east, maintained strength elsewhere and continued to exert influence through fortress colonies, commercial networks, and alliances in the Western Mediterranean. Both republics emerged from the conflict with lessons in strategy, diplomacy, and naval warfare that would inform their approach for the remainder of the century. The Third Venetian-Genoese War exemplified the multidimensional nature of their rivalry. It was fought across seas and continents, through fleets, alliances, and trade, with every decision carrying long-term consequences. The conflict illustrated the inextricable link between commerce and warfare in the medieval Mediterranean. Venice and Genoa had learned that survival depended not only on victory in battle, but also on control of trade, diplomatic agility, and the ability to coordinate across multiple fronts. The legacy of the Third War reverberated for years. Ports that had changed hands faced rebuilding. Trade networks required reorganization. Political alliances shifted. The lessons learned from the war shaped future conflicts and informed the strategies of commanders and statesmen for generations. Venice and Genoa, locked in their enduring struggle, recognized that the Mediterranean would never be entirely safe, and that their rivalry was destined to continue until one republic could secure a decisive and lasting advantage. The end of the Third Venetian-Genoese War brought a measure of exhaustion to both republics. Fleets had been shattered, trade disrupted, and lives lost across the Mediterranean. Venice, however, emerged with a sense of cautious triumph. Its alliance with Hungary and its victories in the Aegean had secured key territories. It reinforced its maritime supremacy in the Eastern Mediterranean and allowed the Republic to consolidate control over the Adriatic. Ports once threatened by Genoese ambition now lay firmly under Venetian influence. The Republic's merchants rebuilt networks, warehouses were restocked, and fleets were repaired. But the memory of the war lingered, shaping strategies and ambitions for decades to come. Genoa, in contrast, faced a period of instability that weakened its ability to challenge Venetian power directly. The Republic's political structures were under strain, fragmented by internal rivalries and the influence of foreign powers. The Visconti of Milan held sway over Genoese politics for a time, asserting military and political authority that undermined local autonomy. French interests also interfered, manipulating factions within the oligarchy and seeking to control Genoa's strategic decisions for their own benefit. The internal turmoil distracted Genoa from fully consolidating its gains in the Mediterranean, leaving it vulnerable to Venetian opportunism. Merchant families argued over alliances, naval priorities, and the allocation of resources. While the Republic's reputation as a unified maritime power suffered, despite Genoa's challenges, The rivalry between the two republics did not abate. Venice continued to expand its influence, asserting control over Adriatic trade routes, fortifying islands, and securing the loyalty of local rulers. Each decision was calculated to limit Genoese encroachment. Venetian commanders patrolled waters with renewed vigilance, aware that any lapse could provide Genoa with the opportunity to strike. Merchants reported sightings of Genoese ships, minor disputes flared into skirmishes, and political leaders in Venice remained constantly attentive to developments along every coast. Peace was a fragile illusion, maintained only through a combination of military preparedness and vigilant diplomacy. The Mediterranean world itself was in flux. Europe's balance of power shifted with the rise of powerful kingdoms and the decline of older feudal structures. The Hundred Years' War between England and France distracted Western powers, while Italy's northern city-states became increasingly embroiled in internal conflicts. Venice capitalized on these distractions, consolidating trade and influence without provoking wider European intervention. Genoa, meanwhile, struggled to defend its interests amid a web of foreign domination and domestic factionalism. The Republic's attention was divided, its resources stretched across multiple theaters, and its capacity to challenge Venetian dominance diminished. The uneasy peace that followed the Third War was punctuated by minor confrontations and political maneuvering. Venetian and Genoese fleets continued to shadow each other along key trade routes. Port authorities reported the arrival of suspicious ships, and merchants recorded disputes over cargoes and tariffs. These incidents, while small in scale, kept the rivalry alive. The republics understood that the underlying tension had not been resolved. Each side monitored the other, anticipating the moment when a spark could ignite a new and decisive conflict. The road to the War of Chioggia began in this climate of tension and preparation. Venice had secured the Adriatic, but the eastern Mediterranean remained contested. Genoa, while weakened internally, retained ambitions in the region. The Republic's merchant families, despite political interference, sought to regain influence and recover lost prestige. Naval commanders prepared plans for future engagements, studying maps, ports, and trade routes in anticipation of renewed hostilities. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would eclipse previous conflicts in scale, intensity, and historical significance. In Genoa, internal instability influenced strategic decisions. The interference of Milanese and French powers created divisions within the ruling oligarchy. Some factions pushed for renewed aggression against Venice, arguing that a decisive strike could restore Genoese honor and commercial dominance. Others counseled caution, wary of overextending the Republic's already strained resources. These disagreements complicated planning, delayed fleet construction, and created uncertainty in Genoese ports. The Republic remained a formidable power, but its unity was fractured, providing Venice with opportunities to assert control and consolidate gains. Venice, aware of Genoa's vulnerabilities, acted decisively. The Republic strengthened its naval presence along critical routes in the Adriatic and the eastern Mediterranean. New fortifications were constructed on islands and key coastal points, and patrols were intensified to monitor Genoese movements. The Great Council coordinated closely with fleet commanders, ensuring that resources were efficiently allocated and that strategic priorities were maintained. Venetian intelligence networks observed Genoese colonies, tracking political developments, merchant activity, and fleet deployments. Every measure reinforced Venice's dominance while preparing for the eventual renewal of open conflict. Diplomatic efforts continued alongside military preparations. Venice maintained relations with kingdoms and city-states throughout the Mediterranean, securing alliances and trade agreements that would provide both economic support and strategic advantage. Genoa, hindered by internal divisions, was less effective in cultivating foreign partners. Nevertheless, it sought allies in Aragon, France, and the eastern Mediterranean, aiming to counterbalance Venetian influence. The complex network of alliances, rivalries, and trade interests ensured that any future conflict would draw in multiple powers, making the stakes of war even higher. The tension culminated in small incidents along contested trade routes. Venetian and Genoese ships clashed over access to ports, taxes, and caravans. Minor raids and blockades tested the readiness of fleets and the responsiveness of political leaders. These actions, though not officially considered acts of war, were unmistakable signs that the rivalry was approaching a breaking point. Venice understood that maintaining control required constant vigilance, and the Republic's leaders were determined to act swiftly when opportunity presented itself. The broader context of Europe shaped the conditions for renewed conflict. The instability of the Italian peninsula, the distractions of Western powers, and the fragility of Byzantine authority created a Mediterranean in which decisive action could yield enormous rewards. Venice's consolidation of the Adriatic and Genoa's fractured governance set the stage for a confrontation in which both republics would commit fully to the assertion of maritime dominance. The historical forces that had driven earlier wars, the pursuit of trade, strategic advantage, and prestige, remained powerful, and both republics were prepared to translate those pressures into decisive action. By the early 1370s, both Venice and Genoa were poised for renewed confrontation. Venice had strengthened its military, secured its alliances, and stabilized its economic base. Genoa, despite internal instability, retained ambitions in the eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea, ready to exploit any misstep by its rival. The conditions were ripe for war. The historical arc that had begun with minor disputes in Levantine markets now approached a climax. Both republics understood that the next great conflict would not only determine control of trade routes, but would also shape the political and economic future of the Mediterranean. The road to Chioggia was marked by preparation, tension, and subtle maneuvering. Venice had consolidated its holdings and projected power across the Adriatic. Genoa sought to regain lost prestige while navigating internal divisions and foreign influence. The Mediterranean remained a theater of both opportunity and danger, where every fleet, merchant, and city-state played a role in the unfolding rivalry. As the two republics moved inexorably toward confrontation, it became clear that the conflict would test not only naval power, but the endurance, strategy, and resilience of both Venice and Genoa. The years following the uneasy peace were marked by an undercurrent of tension that refused to dissipate. Minor clashes, often dismissed as local incidents, quickly became harbingers of the next great conflict. Venetian and Genoese ships exchanged fire in disputed waters, crews clashed over the rights to trade routes, and local governors struggled to maintain order in contested ports. These incidents, though small in isolation, accumulated into a web of grievances, each side interpreting the other's actions as deliberate provocations. Venice, accustomed to periods of temporary dominance, grew overconfident. Genoa, stung by past defeats and conscious of the fractures in Venetian politics, sought revenge. The Mediterranean became a stage where ambition, resentment, and pride intertwined, setting the conditions for a war of unprecedented scale. Genoa's leadership, despite internal divisions, recognized the necessity of a decisive strike to reclaim prestige. The oligarchic families understood that economic and political survival depended on demonstrating strength. The memory of the Second and Third Wars lingered, reminding Genoa that temporary setbacks could be reversed with bold action. Ambassadors traveled throughout Europe, seeking allies and assurances of support. Ships were constructed in secret, fortified, and provisioned. Merchants and bankers provided loans to fund the buildup. Aware that the Republic's future rested on their ability to project power at sea, Genoa's objective was clear: to challenge Venetian supremacy and restore control over key Mediterranean trade routes, particularly in the Adriatic and the Eastern Seas. Venice, meanwhile, underestimated the determination of its rival. Years of relative dominance had lulled the Republic into a sense of security. The Great Council debated fleet deployments and strategies, often assuming that Genoa lacked the resources to mount a significant challenge. Venetian merchants continued to expand trade networks with a sense of entitlement, while naval commanders focused on maintaining patrols and fortifying established positions. The Republic remained vigilant, but a sense of complacency had taken hold. This overconfidence, combined with the fragmented communication between distant commanders and political leadership, created vulnerabilities that Genoa was quick to exploit. Diplomacy, the traditional tool for managing rivalry, began to fail. Repeated attempts to negotiate agreements over trade rights, territorial claims, and naval conduct broke down. Envoys returned with frustration, unable to reconcile the demands of their republics with the ambitions of the opposing side. Genoa accused Venice of encroaching on its colonies and violating agreements. Venice, in turn, condemned Genoa's aggressive maneuvers and interpreted its fleet movements as preparations for war. Letters, envoys, and treaties offered temporary relief, but the underlying hostility could not be mediated. Each republic viewed negotiation as a necessary formality rather than a genuine path to peace. The Mediterranean, ever attentive to the movements of fleets and envoys, waited in anticipation. By the late 1370s, both republics were preparing for the inevitable. Venice began mobilizing its fleet, expanding arsenals, and stocking provisions. The Republic reinforced garrisons in key Adriatic and Aegean islands, while sailors and soldiers were trained for prolonged engagements. Intelligence networks reported Genoese activities, mapping their ports, ships, and mercenary hires. Commanders reviewed past encounters, analyzing victories and defeats to develop strategies that could secure decisive results. Venice's approach combined preparation with an assumption that its experience and established presence would carry the Republic through the next conflict. Genoa, for its part, pursued a more aggressive approach. The Republic consolidated forces coordinated between northern and eastern Mediterranean bases, and recruited mercenaries to supplement its crews. The Genoese recognized that they needed a show of force to disrupt Venetian confidence and to exploit potential overextensions. Naval architects and shipbuilders worked tirelessly, producing galleys that could compete with the best Venice could field. Funding came from the city's wealthiest families, who understood that investment in military power was inseparable from commercial survival. Genoa's preparations were deliberate and systematic, designed to create a fleet capable of challenging Venice across multiple fronts. The Mediterranean itself became a theater of observation and speculation. Traders, rulers, and chroniclers noted the buildup of fleets, the movement of supplies, and the hiring of mercenaries. Cities along the Adriatic and Aegean coasts watched with apprehension. Merchants calculated the risks of delayed shipments or confiscated goods. Local authorities tried to maintain neutrality, fearful that any misstep could invite disaster. The tension was palpable, with every small incident amplified by the sense that a major war was imminent. Venice and Genoa had transformed the Mediterranean into a powder keg, waiting for a spark. Strategic calculations dominated the councils of both republics. Venice focused on defending critical choke points and maintaining open trade lanes, while considering potential offensive maneuvers to preempt Genoese initiatives. Genoa, aware of Venetian dispositions, sought to identify vulnerabilities, to strike at isolated garrisons, and to challenge Venetian control in the Adriatic and northern Aegean. Both republics were aware that the first decisive engagement could dictate the course of the entire war. Preparations were meticulous, extending from the construction of galleys to the deployment of spies and the negotiation of mercenary contracts. The stage for conflict was also shaped by broader geopolitical factors. The Italian peninsula was a patchwork of city-states, each with its own ambitions and rivalries. The Byzantine Empire remained a weakened but influential player, capable of influencing operations in the Aegean and Black Sea. Emerging Ottoman forces began to assert themselves in the eastern Mediterranean, creating additional uncertainty and opportunity. Both Venice and Genoa had to account for these external actors in their strategic planning, ensuring that alliances, treaties, and deployments were coordinated to prevent interference or exploitation. As fleets were assembled and orders dispatched, the human dimension of the rivalry became evident. Sailors prepared for months at sea, knowing that the coming engagements would be grueling and dangerous. Captains studied past encounters, devising maneuvers and tactics to gain advantage. Merchants and financiers watched nervously, aware that the outcome of war would determine the flow of goods, wealth, and power for decades. Citizens in port cities observed the build-up with a mixture of fear and fascination. The tension was collective, a shared experience that reflected the significance of the rivalry between the two republics. Every indicator suggested that the War of Chioggia would surpass previous conflicts in intensity and scale. Venice and Genoa were no longer engaging in isolated skirmishes. They were preparing for a confrontation that would test fleets, garrisons, alliances, and strategic vision simultaneously. The Mediterranean had become a theater of anticipation where every observation and report could influence decisions. The tension that had accumulated over nearly 2 centuries of rivalry now threatened to erupt in a decisive and violent clash. The prelude to war underscored the inextricable link between commerce and conflict. The interests of merchants, the ambitions of oligarchies, and the demands of sailors converged in a single historical trajectory. Venice and Genoa understood that the forthcoming confrontation would determine not only naval supremacy, but also control over trade, influence, and regional prestige. Each republic prepared with the knowledge that failure could have lasting consequences for generations. The Mediterranean, attentive to the movements of fleets and the whispers of diplomacy, seemed to hold its breath. Venice, confident, yet overextended, braced for the challenge. Genoa, determined and ambitious, sought revenge and restoration. Stage was set, the fleets were ready, and the centuries-long rivalry was about to reach one of its most dramatic chapters. The War of Chioggia promised to be a conflict that would test the endurance, ingenuity, and resilience of both republics. Shaping the course of Mediterranean history for decades to come, Venice faced a moment of existential peril. The early Genoese victories at Pola and Chioggia had brought the Republic to the edge of disaster. Panic had gripped the city. Citizens whispered of the fall of the Doge and the possibility that the Republic itself might be erased from the map of the Mediterranean. Yet in the darkest hours, Venetian leadership displayed a resilience that would define its history. The counteroffensive, led by Carlo Zeno and Vetter Pisani, transformed desperation into strategy, fear into coordinated action, and vulnerability into opportunity. Carlo Zeno, a veteran of Mediterranean warfare, understood the stakes. His reputation as a bold and innovative commander was well earned. Vetter Pisani, meanwhile, embodied the tenacity of Venice itself, rising from humble beginnings to command forces that would decide the Republic's fate. Together, they orchestrated a campaign that combined audacity, strategic patience, and meticulous attention to logistics. They understood that defeating the Genoese at Chioggia required not merely force, but careful planning. The disruption of supply lines, and the exploitation of Genoese overextension. The siege of Chioggia was central to the Venetian strategy. The town, strategically located at the southern end of the lagoon, had been occupied and fortified by Genoese forces. Venetian commanders recognized that a direct assault would be costly and potentially disastrous. Instead, they opted for a blockade, sealing off supply routes and preventing reinforcements from reaching the town. Venetian ships formed a cordon around the lagoon, intercepting Genoese vessels, controlling access to the mainland, and systematically tightening the noose. It was a patient, deliberate, and calculated approach, reflecting the maturity of Venetian military thought. Genoese supply lines began to falter. Siege cut off provisions, reinforcements, and communications. Soldiers faced hunger, fatigue, and declining morale. Chroniclers of the period described the mounting desperation within the town. Disease spread as rations dwindled, and discipline eroded under the stress of isolation. The Genoese had been confident after their initial victories, but their early success had stretched their resources thin. Venice exploited these vulnerabilities with precision, transforming the advantages of geography, naval skill, and strategic patience into a decisive reversal. Venetian forces also conducted daring operations beyond the blockade. Small squadrons harassed Genoese outposts, attacked supply convoys, and engaged in psychological warfare. Every encounter served to weaken Genoese resolve and bolster Venetian morale. The Republic's commanders understood that victory depended not only on controlling Chioggia, but on demonstrating that Venice could recover from near annihilation. The psychological dimension of the campaign was as important as the tactical, signaling to allies, enemies, and citizens that Venice remained resilient and capable of decisive action. The role of Carlo Zeno and Vetter Pisani extended beyond tactical command. They coordinated logistics, ensured the flow of reinforcements, and maintained communication between distant fleets and the Great Council. Their leadership inspired confidence among sailors and soldiers, allowing Venice to turn panic into coordinated effort. The blockade, combined with small but precise offensive actions, gradually wore down Genoese resistance. Each intercepted shipment, each skirmish, and each reinforced fortification shifted the momentum toward Venice. By 1380, the siege had begun to take a visible toll on Chioggia. Genoese forces, trapped and isolated, faced mounting casualties and dwindling supplies. The Venetian blockade proved effective, and morale within the town plummeted. Chroniclers recorded the desperate attempts by Genoese commanders to break the encirclement or call for reinforcements, all of which failed against the disciplined coordination of Venetian fleets. Venice's counteroffensive showcased the Republic's ability to combine strategy, patience, and innovation to overcome even the most daunting challenges. The dramatic reversal of fortunes reached its climax as Venetian forces tightened their grip, and Genoese commanders acknowledged the impossibility of relief. The blockade effectively neutralized Chioggia as a strategic asset. Venice's navy maintained control of the surrounding waters, preventing escape and isolating the town from external support. The combination of supply disruption, tactical harassment, and morale decline culminated in Genoese surrender. The Republic that had seemed on the brink of destruction in 1378 now stood triumphant, a testament to resilience, leadership, and the power of coordinated strategy. The rescue of Venice from near annihilation had profound implications. The Republic retained control of the Adriatic, secured trade routes, preserved its political and economic influence across the Mediterranean. Merchants resumed operations, galleys returned to ports, and warehouses were replenished. The city itself, which had teetered on the edge of panic, celebrated a hard-won victory that underscored the importance of endurance, coordination, and strategic foresight. Venice's ability to rebound from a near-catastrophic defeat elevated its prestige and sent a clear message to Genoa and the wider Mediterranean world. Venice remained a maritime power to be reckoned with. The War of Chioggia Phase Two also highlighted the evolving nature of Mediterranean warfare. Naval engagements were no longer isolated confrontations. Victory depended on integrated strategy, supply chain management, coordination across multiple theaters, and the psychological dimension of morale. Venice's counteroffensive demonstrated that even in the face of initial disaster, a republic could leverage organization, leadership, and persistence to achieve a decisive outcome. Genoa, despite its audacious early maneuvers, had underestimated the depth of Venetian resilience and the capacity for rapid adaptation. The conflict also had broader consequences for regional geopolitics. Venice's recovery reinforced its influence over neighboring states and allies. Diplomatic efforts were strengthened, and the Republic's ability to project power became a central feature of Mediterranean politics. Genoa, though not destroyed, faced significant reputational damage. Its failure to maintain early advantages underscored the vulnerabilities created by overextension, logistical mismanagement, and the challenges of sustaining prolonged campaigns. The lessons of Chioggia would inform Genoese strategy for decades, influencing both military planning and diplomatic priorities. Economically, the war left both republics financially strained. Venice had expended vast resources on fleet construction, provisioning, and the maintenance of blockades. Genoa had similarly invested in its early offensive and suffered losses in ships, personnel, and trade opportunities. Yet Venice's successful recovery meant that it could rebuild and stabilize commercial operations more quickly, restoring critical trade flows and reinforcing its position in the Adriatic and Eastern Mediterranean. Genoa, by contrast, had to contend with diminished influence and the need to recover both materially and psychologically from the setback. The War of Chioggia Phase Two thus stands as one of the most dramatic examples of resilience in medieval naval warfare. Venice, facing extinction, leveraged leadership, strategy, and coordinated effort to transform disaster into triumph. The blockade of Chioggia demonstrated the interplay between tactical skill and strategic patience, while the collapse of Genoese supply lines highlighted the critical importance of logistics. The conflict reshaped the balance of power in the Adriatic, reaffirmed Venice's dominance, and set a precedent for the conduct of maritime war in the centuries to come. By 1381, with the conclusion of the siege and Genoese surrender, Venice had not only survived, but emerged stronger. The Republic secured its territories, rebuilt its fleet, and restored confidence among merchants, allies, and citizens. The War of Chioggia, once a threat of annihilation, became a testament to Venetian determination, strategic innovation, and the capacity for decisive recovery. It demonstrated that maritime supremacy required more than ships and crews. It required vision, organization, and the ability to act decisively under pressure. The lessons of Phase Two resonated across the Mediterranean. Venice had shown that even the most formidable adversary could be overcome through careful planning, leadership, and the disciplined execution of strategy. Genoa, humbled but unbroken, faced the challenge of re-evaluating its approach to rivalry with a republic that had proven capable of turning near defeat into decisive victory. The War of Chioggia Phase Two was more than a military triumph. It was a demonstration of resilience, adaptability, the enduring significance of strategic foresight in the complex world of Mediterranean politics. The conclusion of the War of Chioggia marked a turning point in the centuries-long rivalry between Venice and Genoa. By 1381, both republics had endured years of conflict, endured losses of men, ships, and treasure, and witnessed the fragility of their positions in the Mediterranean. Yet it was Venice that emerged decisively victorious, its resilience and strategic skill validated, and Genoa that suffered humiliation and the long-term consequences of overreach. The Treaty of Turin, signed in that year, codified this dramatic shift in power and set the stage for Venice's ascendancy in Mediterranean trade and politics. The negotiations in Turin were tense and carefully orchestrated. Genoa, weakened by military defeat, economic disruption, and internal political instability, approached the talks with little leverage. Venetian representatives, including members of the Great Council, pressed for terms that would solidify their gains and impose consequences for Genoa's audacity. The discussions were conducted with the awareness that the balance of power in the Mediterranean was at stake, and that the treaty would not only end the immediate conflict, but shape relations between the two republics for decades to come. Among the key provisions, Genoa was required to return all captured Venetian territories, including Chioggia and surrounding fortifications. Venetian sovereignty over the Adriatic and Chioggian trade routes was reaffirmed. The Genoese fleet was restricted in size and deployment, limiting the Republic's capacity to project power in the eastern Mediterranean for years to come. The treaty also included economic clauses, compelling Genoa to compensate Venetian merchants for losses sustained during the war, restoring trade flows under Venetian oversight. These provisions reinforced Venice's control over commerce, ensured security for its maritime networks, and delivered a clear message regarding the consequences of aggression. The humiliation for Genoa was profound. The Republic's leaders faced the difficult task of presenting the treaty to a population that had once celebrated Genoese victories with pride and confidence. Political factions within the oligarchy disagreed on how to respond, some advocating resistance or renewed military preparation, others urging compliance and internal consolidation. The reality was stark. Genoa had been checked, its ambitions curtailed, and its influence in the eastern Mediterranean sharply diminished. The psychological impact of defeat and the obligations imposed by the treaty reverberated through the city, influencing governance, commerce, and strategic planning for decades. Venice, by contrast, emerged with a strengthened sense of supremacy. The Republic had survived the brink of annihilation and had converted adversity into advantage. The successful siege of Chioggia and the terms of the Treaty of Turin confirmed Venice's preeminent position in the Adriatic, secured trade routes across the Mediterranean, and reinforced the reputation of its commanders and statesmen. Carlo Zeno and Vetter Pisani were celebrated for their leadership, their strategies now studied as exemplary demonstrations of resilience, planning, and coordination. Venetian morale surged, and the city's merchants resumed operations with renewed confidence in the security and profitability of their networks. The shift in Mediterranean power was immediate and tangible. Venice's dominance in the Adriatic and Eastern Mediterranean became largely uncontested. Genoese influence receded, particularly in regions where Venetian control was reinforced through fortifications, fleets, and alliances with local powers. Trade routes previously vulnerable to Genoese disruption now flowed under Venetian supervision, and the Republic's economic and political influence expanded. Across the Mediterranean, the consequences were recognized by merchants, city-states, and kingdoms alike. The Treaty of Turin did not merely end a war. It codified a realignment of power that would endure for decades. European trade felt the consequences of the treaty as well. Venetian merchants now controlled key routes for spices, silk, grain, and precious metals, directing the flow of goods from the Levant Black Sea, and beyond. Genoese participation in these networks was reduced, and the Republic's capacity to influence pricing, transport, and commercial agreements was constrained. Other Mediterranean powers recalculated their economic strategies in response, recognizing that Venice now held a decisive advantage in maritime commerce. Financial centers from Florence to Marseille observed these developments with a mixture of admiration and caution. Aware that Venice's supremacy would shape markets, profits, and alliances across the region, the psychological impact on both republics extended beyond immediate trade and politics. Venice, having weathered the threat of near annihilation, carried the confidence of a state that had proven its capacity for recovery and strategic mastery. Citizens, commanders, and merchants understood that their republic possessed resilience unmatched in the Mediterranean. Genoa, conversely, contended with a collective sense of vulnerability. The war had exposed weaknesses in command, logistics, and political cohesion. While the Republic retained considerable wealth and potential, the humiliation at Chioggia and the obligations of the Treaty of Turin served as constant reminders of the dangers of overextension and miscalculation. The treaty also reshaped the conduct of future conflicts. Both republics recognized the importance of logistics, naval coordination, and the integration of political, economic, and military strategies. Venice's victory reinforced the value of combined leadership, patience, and strategic foresight, while Genoa's defeat underscored the perils of early success followed by overreach. Subsequent interactions between the republics were informed by the lessons of Chioggia and the Treaty of Turin, influencing diplomatic negotiations, fleet deployments, and commercial planning. The conflict had demonstrated that Mediterranean supremacy depended not only on martial skill, but on sustained strategy and the ability to endure adversity. The Treaty of Turin also had symbolic significance. It formalized the recognition of Venetian supremacy, not only in the Adriatic, but across broader Mediterranean trade networks. Genoa's humiliation served as a cautionary tale for other powers contemplating challenges to Venice's dominance. Chroniclers, historians, and later commentators would describe the treaty as a defining moment in the maritime history of Europe, a turning point in a rivalry that had lasted centuries and that had shaped the destinies of cities, merchants, and seafarers. Alike, economically, politically, and psychologically, the consequences of the treaty were far-reaching. Venice consolidated its gains, expanded influence, and secured the safety of trade routes that had been the lifeblood of the Republic. Genoa, though resilient, faced diminished prestige, curtailed operations, and internal challenges that hindered recovery. The balance of power in the Mediterranean had shifted decisively. With Venice emerging as the uncontested master of key maritime corridors, this supremacy would influence alliances, commerce, and military planning for decades, shaping the trajectory of both republics and the broader region. The Treaty of Turin exemplified the culmination of centuries of rivalry. Venice had transformed near catastrophe into triumph. Genoa had been humbled, and the Mediterranean had witnessed a recalibration of power. The agreement codified not only territorial and economic outcomes, but also the lessons of strategy, logistics, and resilience learned through years of conflict. The consequences extended beyond immediate politics and trade, shaping the mentalities of leaders, commanders, and citizens, and ensuring that the legacy of the War of Chioggia would endure long after the cannons had fallen silent and the galleys returned to port. The Treaty of Turin left Genoa humiliated, but the consequences of the War of Chioggia extended far beyond a single defeat. The Republic entered a prolonged period of political instability, where internal divisions, external influence, and economic pressures combined to erode Genoa's once formidable power. Factions within the oligarchy vied for control, each seeking to steer the city toward recovery while simultaneously advancing personal ambitions. The very structure of governance, which had once enabled decisive naval campaigns, became a source of fragility. Decisions were delayed, consensus was hard to achieve, and the Republic's ability to respond to challenges weakened. External powers sensed opportunity in Genoa's vulnerability. The Visconti of Milan, seeking influence across northern Italy, exerted control over Genoese politics. Their presence was both overt and subtle, shaping appointments, military strategy, and foreign policy. French monarchs also saw advantage in intervening, manipulating factions within the city to secure alliances favorable to their interests. Regional nobles, once restrained by Genoa's maritime strength, asserted themselves more boldly, extracting concessions and attempting to dominate trade or influence local governance. The result was a republic increasingly constrained by foreign control, unable to act with the decisiveness that had characterized its earlier campaigns. Key colonial holdings that had once extended Genoa's influence across the Mediterranean began to slip from its grasp. Outposts in the eastern Mediterranean, the Aegean, and along the Black Sea coast were difficult to maintain amid internal turmoil and external pressure. Venetian vigilance compounded these challenges as the Republic monitored Genoese movements and exploited any sign of weakness. Many colonies were abandoned or fell to rivals, undermining Genoa's strategic and economic position. The city's network of fortified trading posts, which had enabled its merchants to dominate long-distance trade, contracted, leaving Genoa increasingly confined to its immediate surroundings and dependent on European partners. The decline of Genoa's traditional maritime dominance coincided with the rise of a new class of power brokers, the bankers. As the Republic's commercial and naval ventures faced setbacks, financial institutions grew in influence. Genoese bankers provided loans to European monarchs, funded military campaigns across the continent, and became indispensable to the broader European economy. Families such as the Grimaldi and the Doria expanded their reach, using wealth to exert political influence within the city and beyond. The shift from direct maritime control to financial influence reflected a transformation in Genoa's identity, signaling a pragmatic adaptation to changing circumstances, but also marking the retreat of its martial ambitions. While banking and finance provided stability and influence, they could not replace the prestige and security derived from maritime supremacy. Genoese ambitions at sea, once bold and far-reaching, began to shrink. The Republic no longer possessed the resources, cohesion, or political clarity to challenge Venice decisively. Naval expeditions were limited, often reactive rather than strategic. Genoese commanders faced internal constraints, factional interference, and the need to prioritize financial considerations over military objectives. The Republic's identity, long intertwined with the command of Mediterranean trade and the projection of naval power, shifted under pressure, reflecting a fundamental transformation in its role within the region. Despite its decline, Genoa remained a center of wealth, commerce, and culture. The city's streets bustled with merchants, artisans, and financiers. Trade continued, even if diminished, connecting Genoa to ports across the Mediterranean and beyond. The Republic retained pockets of influence, particularly in the western Mediterranean, where local alliances and opportunistic campaigns allowed Genoese fleets to intervene selectively. Yet the scale of operations had changed. The Republic no longer waged wars that could rival Venice in scope or intensity. Its influence was increasingly economic and financial rather than territorial and military. The psychological impact of prolonged decline shaped Genoese society. Citizens and leaders alike understood that their republic had been humbled by Venice and constrained by internal and external pressures. Pride, once rooted in maritime victories and naval prowess, was tempered by the realities of dependence and diminished reach. Families that had once produced renowned admirals turned their attention to banking, diplomacy, and trade in ways that reflected a shift from ambition at sea to influence through wealth and negotiation. This cultural adaptation was both survival and concession, a recognition that the Mediterranean had been irrevocably reshaped by the outcome of the War of Chioggia. The loss of colonies and strategic outposts also influenced Genoa's relations with other powers. Venice, aware of Genoese weakness, consolidated its influence in regions previously contested. Aragon, France, and other Mediterranean states adjusted their expectations and alliances, often favoring Venetian supremacy as a stabilizing force. Genoa's diminished presence reduced its ability to negotiate favorable terms in regional conflicts or to assert dominance over trade routes. Every interaction, from treaties to merchant disputes, reflected a new hierarchy in which Venice occupied the upper tier and Genoa had to navigate a more constrained, reactive position. Internally, Genoa's oligarchy struggled to reconcile ambition with limitations. Political factions debated the appropriate balance between military effort, financial investment, and diplomatic maneuvering. Some leaders argued for renewed naval campaigns, hoping to reclaim lost prestige and territory, but these proposals were increasingly constrained by practical realities. Resources were scarce, consensus was fragile, and the memory of prior defeats weighed heavily on decision-making. The Republic's political energy shifted toward survival, financial strategy, and the management of what remained rather than the pursuit of ambitious conquests. The long-term consequences for Genoa's maritime identity were profound. The Republic's role in the Mediterranean transformed from that of a dominant naval competitor to a more specialized economic power. Banking, diplomacy, and selective commerce became central to its influence, while large-scale naval ambitions were curtailed. Genoa's decline was neither sudden nor complete, but it marked a fundamental shift in the balance of power across the Mediterranean. Venice, having solidified supremacy, became the primary arbiter of maritime politics, trade, and regional strategy. Genoa's decline underscored the enduring lesson that naval and commercial dominance could be ephemeral when political cohesion, strategy, and fortune were compromised. Yet the story of Genoa's decline was not one of complete erasure. The city remained a hub of innovation, finance, and trade, adapting to the changing Mediterranean environment with pragmatism and resilience. Its influence shifted from force of arms to force of capital, shaping European politics, funding military campaigns, and sustaining networks of commerce that reached from the Atlantic to the Levant. Genoa's ability to survive in a transformed Mediterranean reflected its adaptability. Even as the Republic acknowledged the limits imposed by Venice's ascendant power, the long decline of Genoa following the War of Chioggia and the Treaty of Turin exemplifies the intricate interplay between military defeat, political instability, economic transformation, and regional geopolitics. The Republic's internal divisions, foreign interference, and contraction of colonial holdings reshaped its identity and ambitions. Yet within this decline, Genoa demonstrated resilience, recalibrating its strategies, embracing financial influence, and continuing to exert selective power. The transformation of Genoa was both a cautionary tale and a testament to adaptability, revealing the enduring complexities of Mediterranean rivalry and the interplay of commerce, politics, and military might. In the decades following the War of Chioggia, Venice entered a period of unprecedented ascendancy. The Republic had survived near annihilation, emerged victorious, and now faced the challenge of transforming hard-won survival into lasting dominance. The lessons of past conflicts informed every decision. Venice understood that maritime supremacy was not secured by fleeting victories, but through sustained investment, strategic consolidation, and the careful orchestration of commerce, diplomacy, and military power. The Adriatic, once a contested space of fluctuating control, became firmly Venetian. Coastal towns, fortifications, and trade outposts were integrated into a coherent system of governance and defense. Venetian authorities established clear lines of command, ensuring that garrisons were well-provisioned, well-led, and responsive to any threat. These fortifications extended from the northern reaches near Istria to the southern Adriatic coast, creating a chain of strongholds that protected trade routes and deterred potential aggressors. In the Aegean, Venice pursued a parallel strategy, consolidating holdings acquired during prior conflicts, and ensuring that islands and ports were fortified, supplied and connected through reliable naval patrols. The Republic's geographic presence became both a deterrent and a platform for further expansion, projecting influence across the eastern Mediterranean. Investment in shipyards and merchant fleets was central to Venice's strategy. The Republic understood that military and commercial power were inseparable. Shipyards buzzed with activity as galleys, trading vessels, and armed transports were constructed, maintained, and upgraded. Skilled artisans, shipwrights, and craftsmen were employed in large numbers, ensuring that Venice possessed the technical capacity to sustain both commerce and warfare. Merchant fleets expanded alongside military vessels, allowing the Republic to dominate trade networks while maintaining a ready reserve of ships capable of rapid conversion to military use. Venice's economic model, combining trade, taxation, and state-directed investment, ensured that the Republic could finance these endeavors without undermining long-term prosperity. Diplomacy remained a crucial tool. Venice's relationship with the Ottoman Empire exemplified this approach. Recognizing the rising power of the Ottomans in the Eastern Mediterranean, Venice sought to cultivate trade agreements, maintain a balance of influence, and avoid unnecessary conflict. Venetian envoys negotiated terms that allowed merchants to operate in Ottoman ports, facilitated the flow of goods, and secured Venetian interests without provoking hostility. These agreements were pragmatic, reflecting Venice's capacity to integrate diplomacy into its broader strategy of maritime dominance. The Republic balanced caution with ambition, ensuring that engagement with external powers reinforced rather than undermined its supremacy. Economic dominance became a defining feature of Venice's ascendancy. The Republic's merchants extended networks across the Mediterranean, from the Levant to the Black Sea and into Western Europe. Venice controlled key nodes of trade in spices, silks, grains, and luxury goods, establishing itself as a hub for European markets. The integration of Adriatic, Aegean, and Eastern trade routes allowed the Republic to manipulate supply chains, secure profitable contracts, and maintain an economic advantage over rivals. Venice's commercial influence was reinforced by its ability to project naval power, ensuring that trade routes remained secure and that competition, whether from Genoa or emerging city-states, could be contained or countered effectively. The organizational structure of Venice played a crucial role in sustaining ascendancy. The Great Council, the Doge, and specialized magistracies coordinated economic, military, and diplomatic efforts. Decisions were informed by a combination of expertise, experience, and careful deliberation. Venice's political system balanced oligarchic control with the need for flexible, decisive action, allowing the Republic to respond to emerging threats while pursuing long-term strategic goals. Governance was intertwined with commerce and warfare, reflecting an understanding that the Republic's survival and prosperity depended on integrated, coherent planning. Venice's ascendancy also reshaped the dynamics of Mediterranean trade. Merchants from across Europe adjusted strategies to align with Venetian interests, relying on the Republic's ports, security, and networks. The predictability of Venetian control, combined with the capacity to protect shipments, attract skilled labor, and facilitate credit, made the Republic a preferred partner. Genoa, in decline, could no longer challenge this dominance effectively. Other powers, including Catalonia, Aragon, and Florence, recognized Venice as a central node in Mediterranean commerce, negotiating, trading, occasionally contesting its influence within the limits imposed by the Republic's military and diplomatic reach. Military innovation continued alongside commercial expansion. Venice developed tactics for coordinated fleet actions, invested in artillery for naval engagements, and refined strategies for both offensive and defensive operations. The integration of intelligence networks, logistical planning, and mercenary forces allowed the Republic to maintain readiness across multiple theaters. Venice's ability to combine naval innovation with economic strength created a feedback loop. Secure trade routes funded fleet expansion, while fleet expansion ensured the protection of trade, reinforcing the Republic's preeminence. Cultural and societal factors supported Venice's ascendancy. The wealth generated from trade and maritime supremacy facilitated the development of civic institutions, the arts, and infrastructure. Public investment in ports, warehouses, and urban amenities reflected the Republic's confidence and vision. Citizens, merchants, and sailors shared in a collective identity centered on the sea, commerce, and the defense of the Republic. The psychological impact of victory and the memory of surviving near destruction reinforced social cohesion, motivating both leaders and citizens to sustain Venice's dominant position. By the early 15th century, Venice had established a model of maritime supremacy that would endure for decades. The consolidation of Adriatic and Aegean holdings, the expansion of shipyards and fleets, strategic diplomacy with external powers, and the integration of economic and military power created a republic capable of shaping Mediterranean politics, commerce, and conflict. Venice's dominance was not absolute. Challenges remained, and the evolving political and military landscape of the Mediterranean required constant vigilance. Yet the Republic's position was secure, and its capacity for projection and influence unmatched. The ascendancy of Venice demonstrated the interplay between foresight, resilience, and strategic integration. The Republic had learned from past conflicts, from the near catastrophe of Chioggia, and from centuries of rivalry with Genoa. These lessons were translated into practical measures: fortified holdings, disciplined fleets, expanded merchant networks, escalated diplomacy. Venice's success was a product not merely of circumstance or luck, but of deliberate strategy, institutional competence, and the ability to adapt to the complexities of Mediterranean politics. The impact of Venice's ascendancy was felt across the Mediterranean. Genoa, politically fragmented and economically constrained, could no longer project power effectively. Other city-states recognized the strategic advantage of aligning with or accommodating Venetian interests. Merchants adjusted trade routes, alliances were recalibrated, and the balance of power shifted decisively. Venice had transformed from a city that had faced near destruction into the preeminent maritime republic, demonstrating the enduring importance of integrated strategy, resilience, and the capacity to convert lessons of adversity into instruments of lasting supremacy. By the 16th century, the rivalry between Venice and Genoa had shifted from fleets clashing in the Adriatic and the Aegean to the complex, often invisible world of commerce and finance. Naval engagements that had once defined centuries of conflict became secondary to the subtler, yet no less intense, struggle over trade routes, access to markets, and financial influence. Venice and Genoa, each shaped by centuries of maritime experience, now faced competition in which ships could protect goods, but money, credit, and contracts often determined supremacy. Venice consolidated its control over the spice trade through Alexandria, a city that had long served as a critical gateway between the East and the Mediterranean. Venetian merchants established permanent quarters, warehouses, and offices that allowed them to coordinate shipments of pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and other exotic commodities. Venetian influence in Alexandria was both economic and political, reinforced through alliances with local authorities and careful negotiation to secure favorable terms of trade. By controlling the supply of spices and maintaining reliable transport to European markets, Venice ensured not only profit, but a strategic advantage: the ability to influence prices, trade terms, and the movement of goods throughout the Mediterranean and into the heart of Europe. Genoa, constrained by territorial losses and the growing supremacy of Venice at sea, adapted by turning its attention to banking and finance. Genoese families had long been involved in lending and investment, but the 16th century saw these financial networks expand dramatically. Genoese bankers became indispensable to the emerging Atlantic powers, particularly Spain and Portugal, providing capital to fund exploration, conquest, and trade ventures across the globe. By financing Iberian crowns, Genoa secured influence far beyond the Mediterranean, embedding itself in ventures that ranged from transatlantic exploration to the establishment of colonies in the Americas. The Republic's power became increasingly measured not by galleys or fortified ports, but by contracts, loans, and the ability to mobilize capital for complex ventures. This transformation of competition from military to economic was not merely a response to Venice's supremacy at sea. It reflected broader structural changes in the Mediterranean world. Trade routes were shifting, the Atlantic was opening new avenues for commerce, and empires were demanding financing on an unprecedented scale. Venice, with its secure ports and extensive mercantile networks, maintained an advantage in goods and logistics. Genoa, leveraging financial acumen, influenced the flow of capital and the direction of exploration. Both republics operated within a competitive framework that rewarded innovation, risk management, and the integration of economic and political strategy. Venice's dominance in the spice trade allowed it to dictate terms across Europe. Merchants in Florence, Antwerp, and Lyon depended on Venetian brokers and networks to access high-demand goods. The Republic's ability to coordinate fleets for protection, maintain warehouses along key points, and negotiate with Eastern authorities gave it a level of control that Genoa could not directly contest. Venetian economic strategy was sophisticated, combining maritime security, diplomatic leverage, and commercial foresight to ensure that profit and influence reinforced one another. The control of spices, luxury goods, and critical trade routes became the centerpiece of Venetian power, a quieter but no less decisive measure of supremacy than the victories of past centuries. Genoa's financial approach complemented its maritime heritage. While its naval power had diminished, the Republic's bankers retained deep knowledge of trade, investment, and risk. Genoese financiers provided credit for ventures that ranged from outfitting fleets to funding armies, often demanding repayment in commodities, access to markets, or political concessions. The flexibility and reach of these networks allowed Genoa to remain influential, despite diminished naval presence. By investing in exploration, Genoa positioned itself to profit from the global shift toward Atlantic trade. Maintaining relevance even as Venice dominated the Mediterranean's traditional channels, the rivalry between Venice and Genoa thus took on a distinctly modern quality. Economic leverage, contracts, and financial networks replaced fleets and galleys as primary instruments of competition. Venetian merchants sought to corner markets, controlling the flow of essential goods and maintaining regional supremacy. Genoese bankers focused on capital, investment, and the ability to finance ventures that extended influence far beyond the Mediterranean. Both approaches were informed by centuries of experience in trade, navigation, and diplomacy, reflecting a continuity of strategy even as the form of competition evolved. The consequences for other Mediterranean powers were significant. Florence, Milan, and the emerging Iberian states had to navigate the dominance of Venetian goods and Genoese capital. Venice's ability to secure supplies of luxury commodities and influence prices gave it leverage in diplomatic negotiations, treaties, and alliances. Genoa's financial networks enabled the funding of military campaigns, exploration, and colonial expansion, embedding the Republic in European politics in ways that extended beyond its immediate territorial holdings. The Mediterranean became a theater in which influence could be projected through money, contracts, and trade agreements as effectively as through cannon and sail. Venice and Genoa also adapted their internal systems to reinforce these new forms of competition. Venetian shipyards, warehouses, and trade offices operated alongside a bureaucratic structure designed to coordinate economic activity with political authority. The Republic's governance ensured that profit, security, and strategic interests were aligned. Genoa, by contrast, emphasized financial expertise, banking institutions, and networks of investment that spanned multiple kingdoms. Both republics demonstrated that success in the early modern Mediterranean required more than military prowess. It demanded a synthesis of commerce, finance, and diplomacy, carefully managed to sustain influence over long distances and complex networks. Despite the shift toward economic rivalry, the shadow of military history remained. Venice retained powerful fleets capable of protecting trade routes and asserting dominance if required. Genoa, while focused on finance, maintained naval capabilities sufficient to defend remaining ports and secure maritime interests. The memory of centuries of war underscored the stakes of commerce. Control over goods and capital was inseparable from the capacity to protect them. Maritime strategy, fortifications, and naval logistics remained intertwined with economic objectives, reflecting a continuity of approach that linked past conflict with present ambition. The final commercial battles between Venice and Genoa illustrate the adaptability of both republics. Venice transformed victory at Chioggia and subsequent strategic consolidation into economic and maritime supremacy. Genoa, confronting decline in traditional naval power, leveraged financial expertise to maintain influence and profitability. The Mediterranean had become a domain in which control over trade, credit, and capital defined power, demonstrating that rivalry could endure even as the forms of competition evolved. Venice and Genoa had survived centuries of war, adapted to shifting geopolitical realities, and transitioned from martial to economic competition, securing legacies that would resonate for generations. In this period, the Mediterranean witnessed a subtle but decisive reordering of influence. Venice dominated commerce, supply chains, and the logistics of trade, ensuring long-term prosperity and preeminence. Genoa exerted influence through capital, investment, and the financial management of European expansion, shaping the direction of exploration and the funding of emerging powers. The nature of rivalry had changed, but the intensity, stakes, and strategic significance remained as profound as in the days when fleets had clashed in the Adriatic and galleys had fought for every port. By the end of the 16th century, Venice had secured its position as the master of Mediterranean trade, controlling critical routes, markets, and supplies that sustained the Republic's economy and projected power across the region. Genoa, diminished in maritime supremacy, but ascendant in finance, had adapted to maintain relevance, influence, and profitability in an evolving world. The final commercial battles reflected a mature and sophisticated competition, one in which economic acumen, strategic foresight, and the capacity to navigate complex networks became the decisive factors. The 15th and 16th centuries saw the Mediterranean no longer as the uncontested center of European commerce. Portugal and Spain, propelled by maritime innovation and ambition, began to redirect the flow of wealth toward the Atlantic. The spice trade, previously controlled through Alexandria and Venetian networks, was increasingly supplemented by sea routes around Africa and across the Atlantic to the New World. Gold, silver, sugar, and spices from distant continents flowed into Seville and Lisbon, creating a seismic shift in the economics of Europe. Venice, the preeminent Mediterranean power, faced unprecedented strain in maintaining its monopoly over trade and the supply of coveted goods. Venice responded with a combination of adaptation and defense. The Republic leveraged its fortified ports, organized fleets, and long-established trading partnerships to protect existing supply lines. Merchants sought to maintain relationships in the Eastern Mediterranean, Black Sea, and Levant, ensuring that spices, silks, and other luxury goods continued to reach Italian and European markets. Yet the Republic could not ignore the rising tide of Atlantic trade. Prices fluctuated as new sources of commodities entered Europe, and competitors outside the Mediterranean began to challenge the traditional dominance of Venice in goods and markets. The Republic faced a strategic dilemma: how to preserve supremacy in familiar waters, while adjusting to a world in which commerce could bypass centuries-old networks entirely. Genoa, in contrast, capitalized on the emergence of Atlantic trade in ways Venice could not. The Republic's bankers and financiers established operations in Seville, Lisbon, and other key ports, positioning themselves as indispensable partners to Iberian exploration and expansion. Genoese capital funded fleets, voyages, and colonial ventures, embedding the Republic in the economic transformation sweeping across Europe. Genoese influence now extended far beyond the Mediterranean, reaching into Atlantic markets and the growing empires of Portugal and Spain. The Republic's pivot from maritime confrontation to financial facilitation allowed Genoa to thrive even as its naval power diminished, demonstrating an adaptive strategy that converted decline in one sphere into opportunity in another. The shift to Atlantic trade altered the dynamics of Venetian and Genoese rivalry. In the Mediterranean, Venice continued to dominate physically and commercially, yet the overall flow of wealth was increasingly influenced by Atlantic discoveries. Genoa, once constrained, now leveraged financial networks to capture influence over this new economic geography. The rivalry evolved from direct maritime confrontation to a competition of adaptation, strategy, and positioning. Venice represented continuity and mastery of established trade networks, while Genoa represented innovation and adaptability, integrating its expertise in banking with the opportunities presented by global exploration. The redistribution of wealth created profound effects across Europe. Markets in Antwerp, London, and Florence experienced new levels of capital flow. Luxury goods became more widely available, and new financial instruments emerged to facilitate trade and investment. Monopoly over spices and silks was no longer absolute. Genoese financiers, with their presence in Atlantic hubs, gained influence over loans, shipping, and the underwriting of new ventures. The Mediterranean, while still vibrant and strategically important, was increasingly part of a globalized economic system in which the Atlantic played an outsized role. The power and prestige of traditional maritime republics were measured not solely by fleets or ports, but by their ability to integrate into a world increasingly defined by distant oceans, colonies, and empires. Venice's struggle to maintain its monopoly required innovation in logistics, maritime technology, and diplomacy. Merchant fleets were reorganized, warehouses and storage capacities expanded, and alliances with Ottoman and North African powers were reinforced to secure access to commodities. Venice's government-coordinated trade strategy, ensuring that critical routes remained under its protection and that profits from remaining markets sustained the Republic's economy. The Republic sought to extend influence through contracts, partnerships, and agreements that preserved its relevance even as the flow of wealth increasingly shifted to the Atlantic powers. Genoa's adaptation illustrated the changing nature of power in a globalizing world. By focusing on banking, credit, and investment, the Republic secured influence disproportionate to its naval capabilities. Genoese bankers underwrote fleets, financed colonial ventures, and maintained networks that spanned the Atlantic and Mediterranean. This strategic pivot allowed Genoa to remain central to European trade and exploration, demonstrating that influence could be exercised through capital as effectively as through fleets or fortified ports. In this context, Genoa transformed its historical rivalry with Venice into a form of competition that was less visible but no less consequential. Mediated through finance, credit, and the underwriting of opportunity, the rivalry between Venice and Genoa in the era of Atlantic expansion exemplified the broader transformation of Europe's economic geography. The Mediterranean remained a center of commerce, culture, and political influence, but it was no longer the sole determinant of wealth and power. Atlantic trade created new flows of commodities and capital, compelling traditional powers to adapt or risk obsolescence. Venice relied on established dominance and maritime expertise, seeking to secure traditional markets and routes, while Genoa leveraged innovation, financial acumen, and global networks to thrive in a changing world. The interplay between continuity and adaptation defined the rivalry, reflecting centuries of experience recalibrated for a new age. Strategically, Venice and Genoa's approaches were complementary and competitive. Venice invested in fleet security, port infrastructure, and the protection of existing networks, emphasizing the tangible control of trade routes. Genoa, meanwhile, emphasized mobility, financial reach, and integration with emergent powers, influencing markets without the need to control territory directly. Both republics demonstrated that influence could take multiple forms, one visible through ships and fortifications, the other through capital, credit, and strategic facilitation of trade ventures. The rivalry endured, but it had transformed from the violent clashes of previous centuries into a complex contest of economic foresight and strategic positioning. The rise of Atlantic trade also introduced uncertainty and volatility. Commodities reached European markets from distant lands, political alliances shifted rapidly, and the distribution of wealth became less predictable. Venice, accustomed to decades of relative control in the Mediterranean, faced challenges in pricing, supply, and market stability. Genoa, agile and financially focused, often benefited from the volatility, lending to explorers, underwriting shipments, and profiting from the movement of goods and capital across oceans. The nature of rivalry had changed, but the stakes remained high, as the republics vied for influence over the flows of wealth that defined Europe's emerging global economy. By the end of the 16th century, the rivalry between Venice and Genoa had entered its final phase. Venice retained control over Mediterranean commerce, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Adriatic, but faced limitations imposed by the expanding Atlantic trade network. Genoa, weakened in direct maritime power, transformed into a financial powerhouse capable of influencing global trade and exploration. The centuries-long competition between the two republics had evolved from naval battles and territorial conquest to strategic mastery of commerce, credit, and economic networks. The rivalry endured, but it had become a contest of adaptation, foresight, and the ability to navigate a changing world where the Atlantic increasingly shaped wealth and power. By the 17th century, the centuries-old rivalry between Venice and Genoa had entered its final, subtle phase. The thunder of galleys clashing in the Adriatic and Aegean had faded, replaced by diplomacy, negotiation, and the careful management of trade disputes. The world in which Venice and Genoa had once competed for ports, colonies, and control over the sea lanes had shifted irrevocably. The rise of powerful nation-states, the expansion of Atlantic trade, and the consolidation of empires gradually reduced the scale of their influence. No longer could fleets alone determine supremacy. Influence required negotiation, financial acumen, and a capacity to adapt to an economic and geopolitical landscape increasingly dominated by Spain, France, and Portugal. Venice continued to exert authority over its remaining holdings in the eastern Mediterranean and the Adriatic. But the Republic's focus had turned toward the management of trade networks and political alliances rather than conquest. Diplomatic envoys were dispatched to negotiate access, tariffs, and rights with emerging powers. Treaties were carefully crafted to ensure the Republic retained profitable trade while avoiding conflicts that could strain resources or provoke stronger neighbors. Venice's strategic calculations reflected an awareness that military action could no longer guarantee dominance. The Republic's enduring legacy lay in its ability to maintain a balance of influence, preserving prosperity and security in a Mediterranean transformed by the expansion of Atlantic commerce and the rise of centralized empires. Genoa, with its maritime power diminished and territorial ambitions curtailed, increasingly operated through diplomacy and finance. Genoese bankers underwrote voyages, lent capital to monarchs, mediated in disputes across the Mediterranean and beyond. The city's influence was no longer measured by the size of its fleet or the extent of its colonies, but by the capacity to shape economic outcomes, fund wars, and participate in the flow of global commerce. Genoa had shifted from a republic defined by naval supremacy to a republic defined by financial networks, one capable of exercising influence despite the decline of its traditional power base. The final trade disputes between Venice and Genoa were less dramatic than earlier wars, but no less significant. Conflicts over tariffs, access to ports, and the management of Mediterranean commerce required careful negotiation. Both republics had learned from centuries of rivalry that open conflict was costly and dangerous. Venice and Genoa now competed within a framework of legal agreements, alliances, and subtle maneuvering. The rivalry had evolved from decisive battles to strategic competition in commerce and diplomacy, reflecting the broader transformation of the Mediterranean world. During this period, both republics faced pressures from larger powers that increasingly overshadowed their influence. Spain and Portugal dominated Atlantic trade, bringing wealth and commodities that bypassed traditional Mediterranean routes. France and the Habsburg Empire exerted political influence across northern Italy, shaping the possibilities for action and expansion. Venice and Genoa, once capable of dictating the flow of commerce in the Mediterranean, now had to negotiate, adapt, and survive within a system increasingly defined by global trade and empire. The scale of competition had shifted, and both republics were no longer the primary arbiters of European maritime power. The westward shift of the Mediterranean's center of gravity fundamentally altered strategic considerations. The Atlantic became the new theater of wealth and opportunity, diminishing the relative importance of Mediterranean dominance. Venice's control over the Adriatic and Eastern Mediterranean, while still significant, could not compete with the scale of transatlantic trade and colonial expansion. Genoa, operating through financial networks and investment, participated indirectly in this shift, leveraging opportunities created by Atlantic exploration and the funding of global commerce. Both republics adapted to remain relevant, but the nature of their rivalry had fundamentally changed. The decline of direct conflict did not erase the memory of centuries of rivalry. Venetian and Genoese leaders, merchants, and citizens were aware of the legacy of battles, sieges, and diplomatic maneuvers that had defined their history. Cultural memory preserved the stories of Chioggia, Curzola, and the wars of the Levant. The rivalry persisted in the subtleties of negotiation, in the careful maneuvering of trade agreements, and in the quiet competition for influence across distant markets. Yet it was a competition waged not with cannon and galleys, but with contracts, diplomacy, and financial acumen. Venice and Genoa both demonstrated remarkable resilience in this final phase. Venice continued to secure trade, defend territories, and project influence through alliances and strategic positioning. Genoa, through the sophistication of its banking networks, retained relevance and power disproportionate to its diminished maritime capabilities. Adaptizes. Both republics exemplified the capacity of states to adapt over centuries, responding to shifting geopolitical landscapes, merging powers, and economic transformation. Their rivalry, though transformed, persisted as a defining feature of Mediterranean history. The legacy of this last phase extended beyond the republics themselves. Other Mediterranean and European powers learned from the strategies employed by Venice and Genoa, adopting methods of trade negotiation, financial management, and diplomacy that had been honed over centuries of competition. The shift from naval confrontation to economic and diplomatic rivalry influenced the conduct of commerce and governance in the broader region. Venice and Genoa, even in decline, remained examples of strategic foresight, adaptation, and resilience. By the 17th century, the Mediterranean had been irrevocably reshaped. Atlantic powers commanded the flow of wealth and goods, empires consolidated political control, and the nature of maritime competition evolved. Venice maintained a position of regional supremacy, while Genoa exercised influence through financial networks and strategic investment. The rivalry that had begun with galleys clashing in the Adriatic now manifested in subtler, less visible forms, demonstrating that competition could endure even when the instruments of war were no longer central. The final phase of the Venetian and Genoese rivalry illustrates the enduring adaptability of these republics. Each navigated a world in which power had shifted, strategies had evolved, and global trade had transformed the Mediterranean's role. Venice relied on established dominance, commercial expertise, and diplomacy. Genoa leveraged financial networks, investment, and strategic facilitation. Both adapted to survive, to influence, and to assert relevance in a world increasingly dominated by emerging empires and the flow of wealth toward the Atlantic. Their rivalry, transformed from naval warfare to economic and diplomatic competition, remained a central feature of Mediterranean history, a testament to the capacity of enduring institutions to navigate centuries of change. The war that spanned nearly 2 centuries between Venice and Genoa left a profound and enduring legacy across multiple facets of European and Mediterranean life. Beyond the immediate battles and sieges, the conflict shaped naval warfare, commerce, diplomacy, law, and the cultural identities of both republics. The intensity and duration of the rivalry forced both states to innovate and adapt in ways that would influence the practices of states and cities for generations. Naval warfare evolved dramatically as a direct result of the conflict. Both Venice and Genoa invested heavily in the construction of galleys, refining hull designs, rigging, and/or configurations to maximize speed and maneuverability. The need to maintain fleets over decades prompted advancements in shipbuilding techniques, standardization of components, and innovations in maintenance and logistics. Venetian shipyards, in particular, became centers of technological experimentation, producing vessels capable of extended campaigns across the Adriatic, Aegean, and Mediterranean. Genoa, learning from these developments, emphasized agility, armed boarding tactics, and specialized vessels optimized for both trade protection and naval engagement. The rivalry thus accelerated the professionalization of maritime warfare, creating expertise in ship designs that influenced Mediterranean naval powers long after the conflict ended. The prolonged contest also advanced strategic thought and statecraft. Leaders in both republics had to manage not only fleets, but complex alliances, mercenary contracts, and intelligence networks. Venice developed a sophisticated bureaucracy to coordinate naval logistics, diplomatic outreach, and commercial priorities. Genoa, often constrained by internal factionalism and external pressures, focused on adaptive strategies, blending diplomacy, espionage, and selective engagement. These experiences contributed to the development of enduring principles of statecraft, emphasizing flexibility, planning, and the integration of military, economic, and diplomatic tools to achieve national objectives. The lessons of these centuries informed subsequent European approaches to governance, war, and commerce. Economic systems were transformed by the demands of the conflict. The extended struggle required the mobilization of resources, credit, and financial planning on an unprecedented scale. Genoese and Venetian merchants and bankers innovated new forms of credit, bills of exchange, and risk management to finance fleets, expeditions, and trade ventures. This period saw the creation of proto-insurance systems designed to mitigate losses from piracy, naval engagement, and commercial disruption. Merchants could underwrite voyages, distribute risk across networks, and secure their investments in ways that reduced vulnerability while encouraging ambitious trade. The evolution of these financial instruments laid the groundwork for modern insurance and banking practices, demonstrating that commercial innovation often arises from the pressures of conflict. The growth of maritime law was another enduring consequence. With trade spanning the Mediterranean and conflicts threatening the security of shipping, both republics codified rules governing contracts, liability, and the treatment of captured goods. Legal frameworks emerged to regulate commerce, resolve disputes, and provide predictable norms for international trade. Venetian statutes, Genoese mercantile codes, and the jurisprudence of port authorities became models for subsequent maritime law in Europe, shaping the legal structures that governed commerce long after galleys had ceased to sail under wartime banners. The conflict highlighted the necessity of legal clarity and uniformity in facilitating complex economic activity across a contested and politically fragmented maritime landscape. Cultural legacies were equally significant. In Venice, the experience of survival and triumph in the War of Chioggia and subsequent campaigns reinforced civic identity, pride, and cohesion. Art, literature, and public monuments commemorated victories, celebrated naval heroes, and reflected the Republic's maritime ethos. Genoa, despite suffering setbacks, cultivated a culture of resilience, entrepreneurship, and innovation. Families, merchant guilds, and civic institutions preserved the memory of maritime exploits, sieges, and the broader history of the rivalry. Both cities internalized the conflict as a defining feature of their identity, creating narratives that celebrated courage, ingenuity, and the capacity to navigate adversity over generations. The rivalry also reshaped Mediterranean commerce permanently. Venice emerged as a model of integrated economic, military, and political power, demonstrating the advantages of centralized control over trade networks, fleet management, and diplomatic engagement. Genoa's pivot toward banking, finance, and investment illustrated the potential for influence even when direct territorial or maritime power was diminished. Together, the two republics demonstrated complementary approaches to sustaining state power in a competitive maritime environment, providing lessons that resonated far beyond the Adriatic or the Aegean. Education and professional expertise benefited from the prolonged conflict. Naval officers, merchants, and financiers required training in navigation, accounting, strategy, and diplomacy. Schools, guilds, and apprenticeships developed to transmit knowledge accumulated over generations of warfare and commerce. The result was a cadre of highly skilled individuals whose expertise influenced broader Mediterranean society and contributed to the growth of professional standards in trade, navigation, and state administration. Knowledge accumulated from decades of conflict became institutionalized, ensuring that the lessons of rivalry endured beyond the immediate generation of participants. The impact of the rivalry extended to urban development. Ports, fortifications, shipyards, and warehouses were expanded and modernized to support sustained conflict and commerce. Cities were shaped physically and socially by the demands of maritime competition. Venice's lagoon infrastructure, Genoa's harbor defenses, and the organization of port facilities reflected the intersection of strategic necessity and economic opportunity. These urban adaptations reinforced the capacity of both republics to project power, protect trade, and sustain populations, creating lasting urban legacies visible in cityscapes that survive to this day. Finally, the 191-year conflict demonstrated the interconnectedness of military, economic, and diplomatic power. Venice and Genoa exemplified the principle that dominance in one sphere required support from the others. Naval prowess without economic backing was unsustainable. Financial power without strategic foresight could not secure influence. Diplomatic skill without credible force was ineffective. The rivalry illuminated the complex interplay of these factors, establishing a model for integrated state power that would inform the strategies of European states in the early modern period and beyond. The centuries-long struggle also left a profound psychological and historical imprint. Citizens of both republics grew up within a culture shaped by rivalry, learning from childhood the importance of vigilance, negotiation, and adaptability. Generations of leaders internalized lessons about patience, foresight, and strategic calculation. The narratives of heroism, cunning, and perseverance became part of collective memory, embedded in chronicles, civic ceremonies, and cultural expression. This psychological legacy reinforced civic cohesion, ambition, and resilience, ensuring that the experiences of war and rivalry continued to influence decision-making and identity long after the last cannon had fallen silent. In sum, the 191-year conflict between Venice and Genoa reshaped Mediterranean civilization. It influenced naval warfare, promoting technological and tactical innovation. It transformed commerce, encouraging the development of finance, insurance, and maritime law. It shaped diplomacy and statecraft, providing enduring lessons in strategy, negotiation, and the integration of military and economic power. It left cultural legacies, reinforced civic identity, and shaped professional expertise across generations. The rivalry's imprint extended far beyond the Adriatic or the Aegean, influencing the development of European commerce, law, urban planning, and strategic thought for centuries. The war between Venice and Genoa was more than a military struggle. It was a centuries-long laboratory for the development of institutions, practices, and cultural values that would define the Mediterranean and European world. The lessons learned in fleet construction, mercantile management, financial innovation, and diplomacy created patterns of power and influence that outlasted the conflict itself. Venice and Genoa, through rivalry and adaptation, demonstrated the enduring impact of competition, shaping the evolution of states, economies, and societies in ways that continue to resonate in history. The centuries-long struggle between Venice and Genoa left Europe transformed. By the conclusion of the last great confrontations and the slow drift toward economic and diplomatic rivalry, Venice had emerged as the dominant Mediterranean republic. Its fleets patrolled the Adriatic and Aegean with unmatched authority. Its merchant network stretched from the Levant to the Italian hinterlands, providing not only wealth but leverage over the flow of goods, ideas, and political alliances. Venice's supremacy was no longer just military or commercial. It had become a model of integrated governance, blending naval power, economic sophistication, and diplomatic agility into a system capable of enduring for generations. Genoa, meanwhile, had shifted its focus from maritime dominance to financial innovation. The city became the banking capital of the Mediterranean, financing fleets, kingdoms, and overseas ventures. Genoese families established networks of credit that extended into Spain, Portugal, and beyond, influencing the flow of capital that would underpin the age of exploration. In this way, Genoa transformed decline into opportunity, turning the loss of direct naval supremacy into the expansion of economic and financial influence. The Republic's legacy in banking and finance would have repercussions far beyond the Mediterranean, helping to shape the European economy as it moved toward modernity. The rivalry between these two republics had broader implications for Europe as a whole. It accelerated the development of naval strategy, shipbuilding, and maritime infrastructure, which would be critical in the coming centuries of global exploration. Venice's sophisticated logistical systems in Genoa, its financial networks provided a blueprint for emerging nation-states seeking to expand their influence across seas and continents. By forcing both republics to innovate and adapt, the centuries of conflict created a model for integrating commerce, military capability, and diplomacy, influencing the trajectory of European power and strategy well into the Renaissance. The transition toward the Renaissance was shaped in part by the environment that the Venetian-Genoese rivalry fostered. Venice, a hub of trade and culture, became a conduit for the exchange of ideas, technologies, and artistic innovation. Wealth generated from decades of maritime supremacy financed the construction of palaces, libraries, and art. Merchants and diplomats carried ideas across the Mediterranean, blending Eastern and Western knowledge, philosophies, and aesthetics. The cultural flowering of Venice owed much to the stability and resources achieved through persistent competition and adaptation, illustrating the interconnectedness of economic, military, and cultural development. Genoa's influence on the Renaissance was subtler, but no less significant. The city's financiers funded monarchs, explorers, and ventures that extended European reach to the Atlantic, Africa, and the Americas. Genoese capital enabled expansion, exploration, and trade that brought wealth and new ideas back into Europe. In this sense, Genoa played a crucial role in the financial infrastructure of the Renaissance, underwriting the very projects that transformed the European world. The rivalry had compelled the city to innovate, creating systems of credit, insurance, and financial management that would become essential tools in the age of exploration and empire building. The final fallout of the rivalry also reshaped the Mediterranean itself. Venice remained the guardian of the Adriatic, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the key trade routes that linked Europe to Asia. Genoa, through its financial reach, remained influential even as its fleets diminished. Together, the two republics illustrated the dual pathways to power: control of territory and commerce on one hand, mastery of finance and investment on the other. Their competition had accelerated institutional development, improved the efficiency of trade, and expanded the horizons of European states. The Mediterranean entered a new era, one defined not only by trade and naval power, but also by financial sophistication, diplomacy, and the spread of cultural and intellectual exchange. This final phase of rivalry underscored the importance of adaptation in the face of changing circumstances. Venice had learned to consolidate its holdings, integrate commerce with military readiness, and establish a resilient political system capable of enduring both external threats and internal crises. Genoa had learned to convert the decline of maritime dominance into an opportunity for influence through finance. Both republics demonstrated that power could be exercised in multiple forms, and that flexibility, innovation, and foresight were as crucial as bravery and martial prowess. These lessons influenced not only other Mediterranean powers, but also the emerging nation-states of Western Europe. The social and cultural impact of the rivalry was profound. Venetian citizens inherited a legacy of civic pride, maritime knowledge, resilience that informed governance, commerce, and culture for centuries. Genoese society emphasized entrepreneurship, financial expertise, and international networking, creating a social fabric attuned to innovation, risk management, and global connections. The centuries-long conflict shaped values, institutions, and practices, embedding lessons of perseverance, strategic thinking, and adaptation in both societies. These cultural legacies endured even as the practical instruments of rivalry fleets and fortified ports lost prominence. The Venetian-Genoese rivalry also demonstrated the interconnectedness of local and global developments. A conflict rooted in Mediterranean ports and commerce ultimately influenced the expansion of European powers into the Atlantic and beyond. The strategies, institutions, and innovations forged during this long struggle laid the foundation for global trade, maritime law, and financial systems that extended far beyond the Italian peninsula. In many ways, the rivalry anticipated the complexities of modern geopolitics, in which military, economic, and diplomatic instruments must be integrated to sustain influence over time and distance. By the end of the 16th century, Venice stood as the last great Mediterranean republic, a symbol of maritime mastery, commercial sophistication, and cultural achievement. Genoa, while no longer dominant at sea, had established itself as a critical node in the financial networks that would drive European expansion and exploration. Together, the two republics demonstrated the enduring consequences of rivalry. How competition can drive innovation, shape institutions, and influence the course of history. Their story was one of adaptation, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of survival and influence in a dynamic and often unforgiving world. The Mediterranean itself, transformed by centuries of conflict, entered a new phase. The center of gravity of trade shifted increasingly toward the Atlantic, yet the legacies of Venetian and Genoese maritime and financial power continued to influence patterns of commerce, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. The seas they once contested were now pathways for new empires, new trade routes, and new forms of global interaction. The lessons of strategy, negotiation, and innovation remained relevant, demonstrating that even after the cessation of direct conflict, the echoes of rivalry could shape the course of nations and economies. The final fallout of the 191-year conflict between Venice and Genoa thus represents more than the outcome of war. It represents the evolution of maritime power into integrated systems of commerce, finance, and diplomacy. It shows how human ingenuity responds to the pressures of competition. and how cities and states can leave legacies that outlast battles, treaties, and political crises. The rivalry influenced the transition to the Renaissance, prepared the Mediterranean for the challenges of global commerce, and created institutional, cultural, and economic foundations that would endure for centuries. The story of Venice and Genoa is a story of endurance, innovation, and transformation. Venice, rising to supreme maritime and commercial power, became a beacon of culture, governance, and strategic acumen. Genoa, reinventing itself as a financial capital, extended its influence far beyond traditional territorial boundaries. The centuries of rivalry shaped Europe, influenced global trade, and transformed the Mediterranean world. Their competition reminds us that human endeavor, ingenuity, and ambition can persist across generations, leaving legacies that shape not just cities or regions, but entire civilizations. The 191 years of conflict. From the first encounters of merchants in distant ports to the quiet battles of commerce and finance, demonstrate the profound effects of sustained rivalry. It reshaped naval warfare, trade, diplomacy, finance, and cultural identity. It prepared Europe for the challenges of the Renaissance and the expansion of global commerce. Venice and Genoa, through centuries of contest, adaptation, and resilience, created a model of statecraft, innovation, and endurance, whose influence would ripple far beyond the shores of the Mediterranean. Their legacy endures in the institutions, culture, and economic structures that continue to define Europe and the wider world. The rivalry between Venice and Genoa stretched across nearly 2 centuries, a testament to the endurance of human ambition and the relentless pursuit of influence. It began with merchants haggling over markets in the Levant and escalated into full-scale wars that engulfed ports, cities, and the seas themselves. Generations of sailors, soldiers, and citizens bore witness to the ebb and flow of fortune, each victory celebrated and each defeat mourned. The human cost of this prolonged struggle was immense. Thousands perished on galleys and in sieges, families were displaced by warfare, and cities endured the devastation of economic disruption and destruction. The stakes were not merely territorial, they were existential. The survival and identity of each republic hung in the balance, and the people of Venice and Genoa understood that their lives were intertwined with the fortunes of the state. At the heart of this rivalry lay more than military might. Venice learned to harness its geographic advantage, investing in shipyards, port infrastructure, mercantile networks that spanned the eastern Mediterranean. The Republic developed administrative systems capable of coordinating vast fleets, securing trade, and managing diplomacy with precision. Genoa, constrained at times by internal factionalism and external pressures, cultivated a culture of resilience, financial acumen, and opportunistic strategy. Its merchants and bankers could navigate complex markets, fund expeditions, and maintain influence even when the Republic's fleets were diminished. Each city-state demonstrated that survival and supremacy required more than brute force. It demanded foresight, adaptability, and the clever integration of military, economic, and diplomatic tools. The long duration of the conflict allowed both republics to experiment, learn, and institutionalize knowledge. Naval tactics advanced significantly as fleets clashed repeatedly in the Adriatic, Aegean, and Levant. Ship design evolved to optimize speed, maneuverability, and firepower, creating vessels that were both instruments of war and tools of commerce. Naval officers and mercenaries developed professional expertise, honing skills that were passed from one generation to the next. Maritime law emerged as a response to the demands of long-term trade under the shadow of war, codifying the rules of commerce, liability, and conduct at sea. These legal frameworks, combined with the development of credit, assurance, and financial instruments, transformed commerce from a precarious venture into a sophisticated system capable of supporting expansive trade networks. The rivalry shaped not only the immediate Mediterranean world, but the very structures of European economic and legal practice for centuries to come. The psychological dimension of the conflict cannot be underestimated. Citizens of Venice and Genoa internalized the lessons of resilience, vigilance, and strategic thinking. Civic identity was forged in the crucible of competition. In Venice, the triumph at Chioggia and subsequent consolidation of influence reinforced a sense of destiny, maritime pride, and political cohesion. Genoa, often challenged by internal division and external interference, cultivated a culture of flexibility and innovation. The memory of victories and defeats was preserved in chronicles, family histories, and public ceremonies, transmitting lessons across generations. These cultural legacies reinforced both the practical and symbolic dimensions of power, ensuring that strategy, ambition, and resilience remained embedded in the social fabric long after the cannons were silenced. The rivalry also accelerated the evolution of statecraft. Leaders in both republics had to integrate military planning, economic strategy, and diplomacy in ways that anticipated the challenges of a changing world. Venice's centralized governance allowed it to mobilize resources effectively, manage trade networks, and project influence across multiple theaters simultaneously. Genoa demonstrated that even without complete control of the seas, a state could wield power through finance, credit, and strategic alliances. The lessons of flexibility, foresight, and the coordination of multiple instruments of power became templates for emerging European states as they prepared to navigate the age of exploration and global trade. The strategic thinking honed in the Mediterranean centuries of rivalry anticipated the complexities of empire, diplomacy, and global commerce that would dominate the Renaissance and early modern Europe. The economic transformation of the Mediterranean was perhaps the most enduring consequence. Venice emerged as the preeminent maritime and commercial power, controlling key trade routes, markets, and logistics from the Levant to Italy. Its merchant networks facilitated the flow of spices, silks, and other luxury goods into Europe, shaping markets and influencing political decisions. Genoa, shifting toward financial and banking dominance, extended its influence through investment, credit, and underwriting of exploratory ventures. The Republic's networks in Spain, Portugal, and across the Atlantic enabled it to remain relevant in a world increasingly dominated by the wealth of the New World and the emergent Atlantic powers. Together, the two republics exemplified complementary approaches to sustaining influence, one through maritime control, the other through financial ingenuity. The rivalry also reshaped the geopolitical landscape. Earlier, the Mediterranean was the central artery of European commerce, a contested space in which Venice and Genoa projected power. By the late 15th and 16th centuries, the Atlantic began to claim primacy as the source of new wealth, colonies, and trade routes. Venice adapted to preserve its control of traditional markets and ports, while Genoa pivoted toward finance to maintain influence in an expanding world. The struggle between the two republics demonstrates the fluidity of power and the necessity of adaptation. States that failed to innovate or adjust to changing circumstances risked marginalization, a lesson echoed in the rise of Atlantic powers and the shifting focus of global commerce. Culturally, the long rivalry infused both cities with a distinct identity. Venice, the victorious maritime republic, became a beacon of art, architecture, and civic pride. Its wealth supported libraries, palaces, and public works, while its fleets ensured the security and continuity of commerce. Genoa, though often overshadowed in naval battles, cultivated a culture of financial sophistication, entrepreneurship, and global connection. Its citizens became adept at navigating markets, investment, and diplomacy, demonstrating that influence could be exercised in multiple spheres. The rivalry left a mark not only on governance and commerce, but on the cultural imagination, producing legacies that endured long after the conflict itself. The human cost of 191 years of competition was profound, but intertwined with these legacies. Generations of sailors, soldiers, and civilians lived under the constant shadow of conflict. Communities endured sieges, destruction of property, and disruption of trade. Lives were lost not only to battle but to disease, famine, and the broader consequences of sustained warfare. Yet these sacrifices also forged resilience, resourcefulness, and civic cohesion. The people of Venice and Genoa became participants in a historical process that shaped the course of European commerce, politics, and culture. Their labor, courage, and ingenuity were inseparable from the enduring achievements of their republics. The rivalry ultimately shaped the transition of Europe from a fragmented medieval system toward the Renaissance, an early modern period. It demonstrated the value of integration between commerce, military capability, and governance. It illustrated how conflict can drive innovation, from From ship design to financial systems, it showed that economic adaptability and strategic foresight are as critical as martial skill. The lessons learned in these two republics influenced the structure of emerging European states, the development of global trade networks, and the cultivation of civic identity and culture. In this sense, the Venetian-Genoese rivalry was not merely a local or regional phenomenon, but a foundational chapter in the story of Europe's transformation. As the Mediterranean entered a new era, the dominance of Venice and the financial ingenuity of Genoa set precedents that would inform centuries of maritime, economic, and diplomatic practice. The shift of global wealth toward the Atlantic did not erase their influence. Rather, it highlighted the versatility, resilience, and foresight cultivated over nearly 2 centuries of rivalry. Venice became a symbol of maritime mastery and civic sophistication. Genoa became a symbol of financial innovation and global connectivity. The long conflict left both republics with legacies that would resonate far beyond the Adriatic and the Ligurian coast, shaping the Mediterranean and European worlds in lasting ways. Reflecting on this history, one sees a narrative of human ambition, ingenuity, and endurance. The rivalry between Venice and Genoa was more than a series of wars. It was an extended process of learning, adaptation, and state building. It demonstrated the capacity of human societies to endure conflict, innovate in response to adversity, and transform challenges into opportunities for growth and influence. The lessons of this rivalry extend beyond history. Speak to the enduring importance of strategy, resilience, and adaptability in shaping the course of civilizations. The story of Venice and Genoa reminds us that history is both the record of events and the accumulation of human endeavor. Ships that once patrolled the Adriatic, merchants who once haggled in distant ports, bankers who funded empires, and citizens who endured the consequences of conflict all contributed to a legacy that transformed the Mediterranean and influenced the broader world. The rivalry between these republics exemplifies the profound ways in which human ambition, ingenuity, and perseverance can shape history, leaving lessons that endure far beyond the lifetimes of those who lived them. Nearly 2 centuries of rivalry, war, diplomacy, and commerce left Venice as the last great Mediterranean republic and Genoa as a financial powerhouse capable of influencing distant empires. Their struggle reshaped naval warfare, commerce, law, diplomacy, and culture. It prepared Europe for the Renaissance, global exploration, and the rise of Atlantic powers. It demonstrates the interplay of human cost and achievement, illustrating how endurance, strategy, and adaptation define both success and legacy. The 191-year contest between Venice and Genoa stands as one of the longest and most consequential rivalries in human history, a defining narrative of the Mediterranean and a bridge between medieval and early modern Europe. The rivalry ultimately transformed not only the fates of 2 republics, but the trajectory of Europe itself. It left a durable imprint on the systems of governance, trade, and finance that would underpin centuries of European expansion and influence. The Mediterranean, once a battleground of competing city-states, became a stage for integrated commerce, diplomacy, and innovation. Venice and Genoa, through their contest, provided enduring lessons about the relationship between ambition, adaptability, and legacy. They showed that the struggles of generations, when conducted with vision and resilience, can shape the world in ways that outlast war, borders, and time itself. The human stories embedded in this long conflict remind us that history is lived experience. Behind every treaty, battle, and financial transaction were individuals whose courage, skill, and perseverance made possible the achievements of their republics. Sailors braving storms and cannon fire, merchants navigating dangerous trade routes,
anchors underwriting voyages of discovery,
families enduring hardship and loss all contributed to a narrative that spans generations. The human dimension of the Venetian-Genoese rivalry is inseparable from its broader political, economic, and cultural impact. Ultimately, the story of Venice and Genoa is a story of endurance, adaptation, and transformation. It demonstrates the power of rivalry to drive innovation, the importance of strategy in shaping outcomes, and the enduring impact of human ambition on history. From the streets of Acre to the shipyards of Venice, from the banks of Genoa to the markets of Alexandria. The contest shaped not only the fortunes of two republics, but the trajectory of an entire region and beyond. Their legacy continues to resonate, a testament to the extraordinary consequences of sustained competition and the enduring capacity of human societies to adapt, survive, and shape the world around them. The rivalry between Venice and Genoa is a defining chapter of Mediterranean history. It illuminates the interplay between war and commerce, strategy and innovation, ambition and resilience. It demonstrates the long-term consequences of sustained competition on societies, economies, and culture. It reminds us of the human cost of ambition and the transformative power of adaptation. And above all, it shows how the actions, decisions, and endurance of individuals and states across generations can leave an imprint on history that endures long after the last battle has been fought, the last contract signed, and the last fleet has sailed. The 191-year conflict between Venice and Genoa stands as one of history, as longest and most consequential rivalries, shaping the Mediterranean, influencing the course of Europe, and leaving a legacy that resonates across time. Its lessons remain timeless: strategy, resilience, innovation, the human capacity to endure and adapt define the course of civilizations. The story of these two republics is a story of human endeavor, at its most ambitious, most creative, and most enduring. This was a conflict that defined not just a cities, but an entire region and an era. It transformed the Mediterranean from a battleground of competing medieval republics into a stage for the emergence of global empires. It bridged the medieval and early modern worlds, leaving a legacy of naval innovation, commercial sophistication, financial ingenuity, and cultural achievement. The rivalry of Venice and Genoa is a history of ambition measured across generations, a story of human perseverance, and a testament to the enduring power of rivalry to shape the destiny of civilizations. The Mediterranean entered a new era shaped by their struggle. Venice emerged supreme in maritime power, Genoa flourished as a financial capital, and Europe was prepared for the challenges and opportunities of the Renaissance. The rivalry that began with merchants and sailors evolved into a complex interplay of strategy, commerce, and culture that defined centuries. The legacy of nearly 2 centuries of competition reminds us that the course of history is molded by human endeavor, ambition, and the capacity to endure and adapt. The story of Venice and Genoa endures as one of the most remarkable examples of rivalry shaping the fate of nations, societies, and the world itself.